This is Audible.
Recorded Books Incorporated presents an unabridged recording of A Room of My Own by Anne Tatlock, narrated by Kate Forbes.
The four of us turned to where Luke was pointing. In the midst of the struggling crowd there wafted a thick haze of smoke, rising as placidly above the tumult as Wordsworth's lonely cloud. "It's not fire," Rufus, narrow-eyed, hissed angrily. "They've thrown tear gas. They're trying to blind the mill workers, another unfair advantage." We watched as the assaulted men screamed and staggered, their hands lifted to their smarting eyes. Some rubbed their eyelids frantically, trying to wipe away the searing gas, but in vain. A group of police wearing gas masks appeared as from out of nowhere and surged into the crowd, grabbing at the blinded men and subduing them with repeated blows of their billy clubs. When the beaten workers had fallen to their knees or collapsed completely on the street, they were handcuffed and carried off to the patrol wagons. I turned to look at my cousin Rufus, who was clenching and unclenching his bloody fists. He was muttering under his breath, and it sounded something like, "Gotta help Pa, gotta help Pa." In the next moment Luke yelled, "There's Pa! There he is! He's taking on two of them at once!" Uncle Jim alternately swung his fists at his assailants and lifted his arms to ward off the blows of their clubs. "It's not fair, 2 against 1, Luke cried, and Rufus must have thought so too, because before any of us could protest, he had sprinted up from the sidewalk like a track runner and darted into the midst of the fray. The three of us watched him wide-eyed and open-mouthed. I realized only slowly that I held my arm straight out in front of me, instinctively reaching for my cousin, trying to pull him back from the battle. Resignedly, I let my hand fall to my side. "Kill him, Rufus," Luke muttered. "He's going to get killed himself," Simon replied soberly. I could only whisper a prayer wrenched from the very center of my heart. "Oh God, oh God!" And that was all. I was scarcely aware of the tears streaming down my face as helplessly I looked on. The same instinct that had sent Rufus into the battle was inside me. Someone I loved was being attacked, and I wanted to rip apart his attackers limb by limb. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Didn't those policemen know what they were doing? This wasn't just another picketer. This wasn't just any ordinary man. This was my Uncle Jim. My fun-loving, caring, hard-working, mouth-happy, beloved Uncle Jim. "They got Pa handcuffed," Luke replied solemnly. Out on the battlefield Uncle Jim struggled against the restraint. Rufus swung at one of his father's captors, but in a moment the swarming crowd swallowed them up, and they were hidden from our view. "I gotta help too," Luke cried, standing up. I knew how he felt, for I too wanted to rush out there and swing my fists blindly until all my rage was spent. But I grabbed one of Luke's legs, Simon the other. "You stay right here," I ordered. "We never should have come. We never should have—" My words were cut off by a shot, ringing out through the crowd. Luke stopped struggling and stiffened, almost as if struck himself by an unseen bullet. We heard another shot and then another. "They're shooting," Luke said quietly, announcing the obvious. I felt the muscles in his leg tremble. Simon squinted behind his glasses and looked out over the crowd. "Just blanks," he said. "Uncle Jim said they just ignore the guns anymore. They all know the police are only trying to scare them." Just in case, we took cover again in the alley and listened for more gunfire. In spite of the tear gas, the fighting continued as fiercely as ever. The crowd actually grew as reinforcements were added to both sides, lawmen surging in from one side, strikers from the other. Word of the riot must have gotten back to strike headquarters, because dozens of men wielding baseball bats, clubs, and knives joined the throng from the direction of the warehouse district. By now, a host of wounded men lay moaning or unconscious in the streets. The police went about collecting them as quickly as they could and hauled them away like so much dead wood. Other bleeding strikers were carried to vehicles that had arrived, tires screeching, from the warehouse district. I figured they were being taken to the strike hospital. Man after man fell and was carried in one direction or the other toward the union's rented warehouse or toward the long line of patrol wagons. I had a good idea which direction Uncle Jim was going. For several minutes, no more shots were fired. But then another shot rang out, and a great roar of anger went up from the crowd. One of the strikers on the edge of the crowd facing us suddenly threw up his hands and thrust out his chest as a look of surprise crossed his face. The man staggered and tried to stand, but sank to his knees instead. He lifted his right hand to his chest where a red spot appeared on his shirt like a bud, then spread like the opening of a rose. With his quizzical eyes still open, the man fell face forward onto the street, shivered a moment, and then lay still. "They killed him," Luke said flatly. "That was no blank. That was a real bullet." "Yeah, that was real," Simon confirmed with a nod. "Looks like he was shot in the back, and the bullet went clean through." Staring immobile at the freshly fallen corpse, I suddenly felt detached from the scene around me. Surely this was all pretend, a carefully arranged scene. Surely the man running the camera on top of the truck would cry, "Cut," and the action would stop. Surely the man face down in the street would push himself up again, wipe the dust from his pants, and go off whistling. "He can't be dead," I said, shaking my head. Still unable to take my eyes from the corpse, I grabbed Simon's hand. "He's not dead, is he, Simon?" Before Simon could answer, 2 men, obviously mill workers, rushed up to their wounded companion on the sidewalk, the man Rufus and my brother had dragged off the street. One bent over him, and as Simon had done earlier, felt his neck for a pulse. The other gently touched the wounded man's head and said, "Look at here, someone tied a shirt." He interrupted himself when he spotted us, crouched between the buildings. "Hey," he yelled, "what are you kids doing there? Are you crazy? You go on home. Go on, get. You want to get yourselves killed or something?" The other man, more concerned about his downed companion, said, "Come on, Joe, let's get him to the car." He lifted the man's legs around the knees, while Joe slid his arms under the man's shoulders. Without waiting to see whether we left, they hurried their wounded toward the car and the strike hospital. Simon squeezed my hand. "Come on, Ginny," he said. "I think we'd better get out of here like the man said." Numb and senseless as a sleepwalker, I let Simon pull me up and drag me out of the alley. Just beyond our hiding place, the sidewalk glistened with the blood of the wounded man who had just been hauled away. I walked up against the front of the building to avoid the crimson spot. Simon yelled back over his shoulder, "Come on, Luke, we gotta get out of here." Luke shook his head and made no move to get up. "I'm staying put." Simon started to protest, but before I knew what was happening, he suddenly cried out and fell to the sidewalk. "Simon!" I cried, dropping to my knees beside him. "Simon!" Fresh tears broke loose from the cistern of horror inside me and mingled with my screams. Though I couldn't see the wound, I was sure my brother had been shot, and that he was dead. Chapter 19. Like the corpse in the street, Simon lay with his forehead pressed to the hot cement, his shattered glasses straddling a crack in the sidewalk a few feet from his head. I wrung my hands, wondering what to do. Then, to my surprise, Simon moaned. Tentatively, he raised one hand to his head. He was bleeding, I finally realized, from a wound just beside his right brow, and I wondered whether a bullet had sliced his skull and entered his brain. I thought I might faint, but I forced my trembling hands to turn my brother over on the sidewalk. By now Luke was beside us, holding a rock. "This is what hit him," my cousin explained. "It landed right at my feet." I looked at the rock, then at Luke's face. "Are you sure it was a rock that hit him?" I asked. "Not a bullet." Luke snorted. "If it'd been a bullet, it would have blown his head clear off. Your head's still there, ain't it, Simon?" Simon sat up, and when he did, blood dripped from his cut brow and onto his bare chest. "Yeah, it's still here," he moaned. "I know it is, 'cause it's killing me." I let go a great sigh of relief and would have thrown my arms around my brother if it hadn't been for the blood. Still shaking, I lifted my cotton skirt and ripped a jagged piece of material from the thin, attached petticoat. "Here, Simon," I said, pressing the cloth against his forehead. "Hold this on the cut." He obediently pressed the improvised bandage to his head, then asked, "Where's my glasses?" On hands and knees I retrieved them from the sidewalk and handed them out to Simon. Both lenses were shattered, and the frames were bent. Simon slowly lifted the tangled object from my palm. "They broke my glasses," he said mournfully, and he sounded so pitiful I started to cry again. Then he said, "Oh, it's all right, Jenny. Don't start bawling. Let's just get out of here. You coming, Luke?" "Nope, I'm staying." "You're crazy." "I gotta see what happens to Pa and Rufus." "But Aunt Sally will die if she knows you're here," I protested. Luke shrugged. It would be impossible to persuade him to come home with us. Nodding toward the chaos in the street, I relented, saying, "Look, just don't go out there, all right? Stay put in the alley." "All right." "Promise?" "Yeah, now, go on. You better tell Ma that Pa's been arrested." "Can you walk?" I asked Simon. He nodded and stood, pressing the torn cloth to his head with one hand and clutching what was left of his glasses with the other. I put my arm around his bare shoulders, and together we hurried away from the scene of the riot. I felt for the nickel in my skirt pocket. "Let's try to catch the trolley," I said breathlessly as we made our way toward the warehouse district. "You got money?" "Just a nickel." "Which one of us is going to walk home?" "Neither. The driver's got to let us both on. You've been hurt." I felt Simon's shoulders lift as he shrugged. "You can ask him, I guess." We had to wait only a couple of minutes at the stop before the trolley arrived. I pushed Simon ahead of me up the stairs to the driver, where I held out the nickel in the palm of my hand. I felt like Oliver Twist as I pleaded, "Please, sir, I only have a nickel, but my brother's been hurt, and I want to get him home. My father is Dr. William Ada, and he's good for the other nickel." The motorman was a huge fellow with a full moon face and a thick neck that bulged out over the back of his sweat-soaked collar. He gazed at the pitiful picture Simon and I made and said kindly, "Keep your nickel, little lady, and you and your brother have a seat. I'll take you where you need to go." I was tempted to throw my arms around his thick neck, so sorely did I need that bit of human kindness at that moment. His words caused a fresh batch of tears to well up in my eyes, and I could scarcely catch my breath to thank the man. He nodded toward the seats and said, "Go on now. I have a schedule to keep, and the sooner we get the lad home, the better." Simon and I turned and started down the aisle, realizing for the first time that we were not alone on the trolley, and must appear as quite a spectacle to the half-dozen or so passengers who stared at us quizzically. Only one man, absorbed in his newspaper, seemed not to notice the wounded, half-naked boy and the weepy girl who accompanied him. I sniffed loudly and slid into an empty seat. Simon sat down beside me. The curious eyes pressed heavily on my back, and my face burned in anger and humiliation. Yes, I was crying, and yes, I had begged the driver for a ride, but didn't these people know what was happening only blocks away? How dare they complacently go about their business while men were being beaten and killed in the streets? What right had they to stare at me as though I were the strange one? Simon seemed not to care about our fellow passengers. He sat indifferently nursing his wound, but I cried quietly all the way home, wiping my eyes and nose with the back of one hand. Just before our stop, Simon mumbled, "We're going to catch trouble from Mama, Jenny." I sniffed and replied vaguely, "I don't care." Suddenly Mother's wrath appeared amazingly mild compared with the violence I'd just seen. "We shouldn't have gone," he continued, shaking his head slowly. "We shouldn't have done it." Maybe not, but we had gone, and there was no covering up that fact now. "I wish they hadn't busted my glasses," Simon continued. "Everything's blurry without them." "Papa'll get you a new pair." I sniffed loudly, then asked, "How's your head feel?" "Hurt some, but I think the bleeding stopped." "Maybe you'll have a scar like Uncle Jim." "Maybe, if I'm lucky." When we reached our stop a couple blocks from home, we again thanked the driver. He said, "Have your father clean that wound with a little peroxide. That ought to take care of it." A paternal smile lighting his round face, he patted Simon's shoulder with his doughy hand before we exited the trolley. Simon and I approached the house with a sense of foreboding, not for ourselves, but for Aunt Sally, because of what we had to tell her. We found her and Mother, as we expected, seated in front of the radio, listening for bulletins about the riot. When we arrived, a daytime drama was playing, and the radio's volume was turned down low. Aunt Sally was sitting in the rocking chair with a linen handkerchief pressed to her forehead. When she saw us, she gasped, and her face blanched even paler than it already was. Mother jumped up from the couch, crying, "Simon, what happened to you?" She rushed to Simon, and lifting his chin with one hand, she removed the strip of my petticoat from his forehead. Gazing at the wound, she asked, "How did this happen? And where on earth is your shirt?" "I was hit with a rock, Mama," Simon explained. "It smashed my glasses to bits." He held up the shattered spectacles for Mother to see. "A rock? On your way to the drugstore?" "No, ma'am." Aunt Sally interrupted. "Where are Rufus and Luke? Lillian said you four went out together." "They didn't come back with us, Aunt Sally," I confessed reluctantly. "Then where are they?" I looked hesitantly from my aunt to my mother. I didn't want to admit where we had been, where my cousins were. But as I had already realized on the trolley, it couldn't be avoided. Mother, impatient with my hesitation, insisted, "Speak up, Virginia. Tell us what's happened. Then I want to get Simon cleaned up. Of course your father isn't here to tend to this cut. He always seems to be absent at the worst possible moments." "Where is he, Mama?" I asked. "Harold got called down to the strike hospital about an hour ago, and your father decided to go with him. The reports have been that there's a bad riot going on down at the grain mill, the worst yet." Simon nodded his head and replied sheepishly, "We were there. We saw it." Aunt Sally gave a brief, anguished cry and held her handkerchief up to her open mouth. Mother's face grew stormy with anger and concern. "What do you mean you were there? Didn't you tell me you were going to the drugstore for a soda?" My heart beat rapidly and my palms grew sweaty. "Rufus and Luke wanted to go to the grain mill," I explained, trying at least to pass some of the blame along to my cousins, where I thought it properly belonged. "They wanted to see the picket line." "Dear God in heaven," Mother cried, "have you completely lost your senses? There have been reports of gunfire. Don't you know you could have been killed?" Aunt Sally leaned forward in the rocking chair and asked anxiously, "Is that where the boys are now?" "Yes, Aunt Sally." Before I could add more, Simon volunteered the dreaded information. "We saw Uncle Jim handcuffed. 2 policemen were beating him, and they handcuffed him. Rufus went out to try and help him." "Rufus?" Aunt Sally started. She stopped and looked up at Mother in disbelief, then patted her upper lip with the cloth she clutched in her hand. "Rufus went out into the fighting?" she asked hesitantly, as though afraid of the answer. Simon and I nodded in unison. "We couldn't stop him," I explained. "And Luke?" "He stayed in the alley. We were watching the riot from an alley across the way," said Simon. "We tried to get him to come home with us, but he wouldn't come." "I made him promise to stay put, though, and not go out into the street," I said, hoping to bring some comfort to my aunt. I don't think I was successful. Aunt Sally's lips moved, but no words came out. She slumped back in the chair, shut her eyes, and held her hands over her heart. In a moment, 2 tears slid out from beneath the closed lids and slithered down her face. "Oh, Lillian," she moaned. Mother left Simon to take her sister's limp hand. "It'll be all right, Sally," Mother said. "It sounds like Jim's been arrested. That means he's out of the fight. I guess he'll be taken to jail, but at least he'll be safer there than on the picket line." "Yes, I suppose you're right," Aunt Sally agreed. "But Rufus—" A sob clutched her chest. Her shoulders heaved forward as she gave in to it. "They said on the radio 3 men are dead already." I saw in my mind the man who was surprised by the bullet, how he looked as though he'd only received a bit of news he couldn't quite believe, and how he dropped to his knees and spent the last moments of his life trying to make sense of the blood oozing from the wound in his chest. Mother patted her sister's hand and sighed. "We can pray, Sally. Rufus was foolish to do what he did, but we can pray for his safety." Aunt Sally took a deep breath and held it as if she were trying to breathe in courage from the air around her. She let it out slowly, then whispered, "All right, Lillian, all right. I'll try to pray." After a quiet moment, Mother said, "Virginia, you stay here with Aunt Sally while I take care of Simon." She crossed the room to Simon, and I sat down obediently on the end of the couch near Aunt Sally's rocking chair. Just before Mother and Simon stepped out into the hall, Aunt Sally, trying bravely to smile, asked, "What did happen to your shirt, Simon?" But before my brother could explain, I spoke up in his defense. There was a man lying hurt in the street, not far from us. Rufus and Simon pulled him up to the sidewalk. A policeman had hit him in the head, and he was bleeding, so Simon took off his shirt and wrapped it around the man's head like a bandage. Aunt Sally nodded in satisfaction. "Well, you're your father's son, aren't you, Simon?" Simon beamed and smiled broadly. Mother, her arm around Simon's shoulder, seemed less impressed. Her only response was to say, "I hate to think of what you children saw down there." She disappeared with Simon into Papa's office. Aunt Sally and I sat in silence, waiting for news. My aunt stared tensely at the radio while I peered at her from the corner of my eye. Her face remained ashen, and even her lips were white, and I could see the pulse thumping in the hollow of her slender neck. The clock on top of the piano continued to tick away the minutes above the sheet music that Simon and I had tried to play together only a few hours before, when we were young. With the waves of reinforcements that came in on both sides, the riot lasted more than 4 hours and was finally quelled only when the governor called in the National Guard. It had been a slaughter in the streets. The last numbers we heard that night were 8 dead and more than 500 wounded. Among the fatalities were 5 mill workers, 2 policemen, and 1 deputy sheriff. The latter was a man who had been deputized only the day before. His actual vocation was that of selling life insurance. A young man, he left behind a wife and 2 small children. It was well after midnight when Papa and Dr. Hal returned from the strike hospital, bringing Luke with them. Luke had made his way to strike headquarters by following the cars that were hauling away the wounded picketers. He knew Dr. Hal would be there and could eventually give him a lift home. Mother, Aunt Sally, Simon, and I were still in the parlor, our tense vigil having been interrupted only long enough to eat a bite of dinner and put Claudia and Molly to bed. Simon, who hadn't wanted to go to his own room, was asleep on the couch with his bandaged head resting on Mother's lap. Aunt Sally sat in the rocking chair, fanning herself with one of the funeral parlor fans while staring intently at an invisible spot on the wall. I was curled up in one of the wing chairs, drowsy but avoiding sleep, fearing the dreams that might come when I shut my eyes. Neither my mother nor my aunt had asked me to go into detail of what I'd seen at the grain mill, and I didn't want to tell them. If I had had to put it into words, if I had had to say, "I saw a man die," then I could no longer deny the reality of it. The death would become fact, and I couldn't pretend that it wasn't so, and it was just too awful to believe. Mother allowed me to stay up with her and Aunt Sally, knowing instinctively that I needed to be near them. We had turned off the radio a couple of hours earlier. Mother was reading aloud from the Psalms while Aunt Sally and I listened. At least I tried to listen, but I found it difficult to concentrate on the words. The scenes from that afternoon kept wanting to replay themselves in my mind, and I had to consciously push them away. Only when we heard the faint crunching of the Buick's tires over the gravel in the alley did Mother abruptly stop reading and Aunt Sally turn her eyes from the spot on the wall. "They're home," Mother announced mildly, as though they were returning from an ordinary house call. She closed the Bible and put it aside, then lifted Simon's head gently from her lap and slipped out from beneath his sleeping form. Aunt Sally jumped up from the chair and left it momentarily rocking without her. Still clutching her tear-moistened handkerchief to her heart, she rushed across the parlor toward the kitchen, with Mother and me following. "Oh, Luke, thank God!" I heard Aunt Sally exclaim in the next moment, and when I got to the kitchen, she was down on her knees with her arms about her youngest child. She was crying again, and her shoulders shivered as she sobbed. "Oh, I'm all right, Ma," Luke assured her. "You don't have to cry." His hair stuck up in all directions, and his eyes had the glassy look of interrupted sleep. One side of his overalls was undone, and the bib hung lopsided in front, while the strap trailed him like a tail. Aunt Sally continued to cling to Luke as she looked up at Papa and Dr. Hal. Both men appeared heavy with fatigue. Their faces sagged under the weight of overwork. I'd never seen Dr. Hal look so middle-aged, nor Papa so old. Funny, you could leave the house one age and only a short time later come back another. "Where's Rufus?" Aunt Sally asked anxiously. "He's all right, Sally," Papa said softly. "But where—" "He was asleep on one of the cots at the strike hospital by the time we left, so we decided to just let him be. Harold will go down in the morning and bring him home." "But is he hurt?" Dr. Hal shook his head. "Nothing serious, just some cuts and bruises. Worst thing is a bump on the back of his head. Must have been a billy club that knocked him out, but there was so much going on at once that he's not sure exactly what hit him. By the time he was brought to us at the strike hospital, though, he was talking and coherent and aching to go back out into the fight. Dr. Howe let go a little sniff of a chuckle. Of course we didn't let him go, and finally he gave up and fell asleep. He was one of the lucky ones, lucky he wasn't hurt bad, and lucky he didn't get arrested. But what could have he been thinking to go out there in the middle of a riot? Her voice trailed off. Still on her knees, she looked at Luke. They were beating up on Pa, Luke explained. You couldn't expect Rufus to just stand by and watch, could you? Aunt Sally dropped her head. Oh, Rufus, she whispered. Mother, ever practical, stood at the pantry door tying on her apron. You men must be starving, she said. Sit down and let me fix you something to eat. I'm starving too, Aunt Lillian, Luke cried, pulling away from his mother's grasp. I figured as much. Go on and have a seat. It won't be a moment. While Mother pulled 3 plates out of the cupboard, Papa and Dr. Howe seated themselves wearily at the table, dropping their medical bags on the floor beside them. Papa briefly rubbed his forehead with both hands, then acknowledging my presence for the first time, he smiled up at me. I stood shyly against one wall, not quite sure I belonged in this group, but wanting to. Wanting, most of all, simply to be in the same room as Papa. Luke scrambled into a chair, and Aunt Sally sat down at the table beside him. Tentatively, her words almost a whisper, she asked the question that was on all of our minds, but we dreaded to ask. Any word about Jim? Dr. Howe sighed. He wasn't at the strike hospital. Word has it he was taken to jail. A lot of men were arrested today, Papa added. Those jail cells are going to be plenty crowded tonight. They'll probably be taking the overflow to the next town, maybe even the town after that. Mother set heaping plates of cold chicken, potato salad, and homemade bread on the table, following those with 3 large glasses of lemonade. Luke and Dr. Howe ate hungrily. Papa picked at the food and chewed thoughtfully. I'm surprised you didn't have to stay down there all night, Mother stated. Well, Dr. Wilson and all 4 nurses are still there, and of course the worst cases were farmed out to the hospitals. Every hospital in the city is packed to the gills about now, Papa explained. The strike hospital isn't set up to do complicated surgery, and a good number of men needed bullets removed. Will did take out 1 bullet, Dr. Howe interjected. Rex Atwater caught 1 in the shoulder. He refused to leave headquarters, though. He knew he'd be arrested if he did. How is he? Mother asked. As well as can be expected, I think, replied Papa. He's as stubborn as a mule, that one. He wouldn't even accept chloroform. Said he needed to stay alert. So I had to operate without... He looked up at me again and interrupted himself. He didn't like to go into too many details about his work when his children were around. Well, he continued, stabbing his fork into a piece of potato, there's always the risk of infection, but my instinct tells me he'll pull through without complications. Aunt Sally's voice held a hint of anger when she commented, I hope that Rex Atwater isn't married. That's all I have to say about him. And if he is, God help his wife. Dr. Howe chewed and spoke at the same time, one cheek bulging with food. We were plenty busy, though, I'll say that, even with the number that were sent to the hospitals. We left dozens of men sleeping on the floor of the warehouse because there weren't enough cots to go around. There's been an injunction issued against picketing, you probably heard, he continued, glancing up at Mother and Aunt Sally. So it looks like there won't be a picket line tomorrow. But even if there weren't an injunction, I don't think there's enough men able to stand upright to keep the strike going. Nevertheless, Rex is determined to keep it going, Papa countered, though in my estimation the mill workers are beat. I hope it's over, Aunt Sally said quietly. Even if the workers lost, I just hope they decide to call off the strike. Silence settled over the kitchen, broken several minutes later when Simon staggered drowsily into the room, rubbing his eyes and yawning. Hi, Papa, he said when he saw our father sitting at the table. Papa held out a hand and beckoned him over. Come here and let me see that cut. Did Luke tell you? He said you had a little mishap with a rock. My glasses got broken, Pa. Papa lifted the bandage on Simon's forehead and inspected the wound beneath. Well, it's not deep, he determined. It looks like your mother cleaned it well. As for the glasses, we'll get you down to the optician tomorrow and have another pair made. Papa patted Simon on the shoulder, but then he looked at my brother sternly, or as sternly as Papa could, and said, "You were wrong to go down there, Simon. You know that, don't you?" Simon nodded dolefully. "Yes, Papa." My father looked up at me to include me in his reprimand. "You too, Jenny." "Yes, Papa," I said. The scene before me started to swim as my eyes glazed over with tears. I thought I had used them all up, but I was wrong. "You too, Luke," Aunt Sally added. "You know the grain mill was off limits to you and Rufus." Luke, his mouth full of chicken, mumbled, "Yes, Ma." "It was very wrong to tell your mother you were going one place," Papa scolded, "then go to another place where you had no right to be." Luke must have told him about our scheme, perhaps trying to place most of the blame on me, as I had done to him and Rufus. Papa continued, "I'm very disappointed in both of you, that you conspire to lie and disobey us." Nothing cut me to the quick more keenly than to disappoint Papa. I promised myself in that moment that I would try never to do anything wrong again. I have a feeling that just as virtue is its own reward, this evil has been its own punishment. You're no doubt sorry you went down to the grain mill today, after all that's happened. The tears coursed freely down my cheeks. "Yes, Papa," I said, with Simon echoing my words. "And I can trust you not to do any such thing again." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "Oh, yes, Papa," we agreed. Our father nodded, satisfied, though I had an idea Mother was mulling over the possibility of some additional punishment. I would accept gladly whatever punishment she doled out, hoping it would help to wipe out the memory of what I'd seen. "Why don't you children go on to bed now?" Papa ordered quietly. "It's been a difficult day for all of us, and we need our rest. Time to dry those tears now, Jenny. A person can't sleep and cry at the same time." I was a little embarrassed to be crying in front of everyone. I sniffed loudly and wiped the tears off my cheeks with both hands. Luke didn't help me feel any better when he said, "Aw, you know how girls are. She's been bawling all day." "That's enough, Luke," Aunt Sally intervened. "Time for you to get to bed, too." My cousin rose from the table, carrying a chicken leg away with him. He and Simon and I said good night and gave kisses all around, even to Dr. Hal, as that night it seemed somehow appropriate. As we turned to go, Simon suddenly said, "Oh, there was a man with a shirt around his head." Dr. Hal chuckled and wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Was that your shirt, Simon?" My brother nodded. "We wondered how a boy's shirt got around that man's head, didn't we, Will?" "Did you see him then?" Simon asked anxiously. "Yep, he's asleep down at the strike hospital right now," Dr. Hal said. "I wanted to help him." Papa smiled. "You no doubt helped to stop the bleeding. That was an important first step in saving his life." Dr. Hal winked at Simon from across the table. "Good job, Dr. Simon," he said. Simon, smiling broadly, stood basking in the glow of the older men's praise until Mother brought him back to earth by saying, "That still doesn't make it right, though. You are being where you didn't belong. Off to bed now, all of you." As we left the kitchen, I heard Aunt Sally ask, "What do you think will become of Jim?" But I didn't hear the answer, if anybody had one to give. I was exhausted in body and soul, but was still awake a few hours later, when Papa came into the study for the first order of the day. I think I startled him when I said, "Papa?" He turned from his desk to peer at me through the dimness of the room. "You awake, Jenny?" "Yes." "Can't sleep?" "No." "Still thinking about things?" "I guess so." "Would you like me to fix you some warm milk?" The thought made my stomach turn. "No thanks, Papa." "Well, try to get a little sleep." Papa turned back to his Bible, and I lay quietly a moment, unwilling to close my eyes. I had been thinking about the man who was shot, and that Simon might have been hit by a bullet instead of a rock, and that I myself might have been downed by stray gunfire. It was the first time in my short life that I actually realized my own mortality, and the mortality of those I loved. "Papa," I asked, "does it hurt to die?" My father turned back around to look at me, chuckling and frowning at the same time, as though not quite sure how to react to such a question. He laced his fingers together and rested his hands over the back of the chair. "Well, that depends," he said. "Sometimes death is painful, but other times, most often, I think, people just kind of drift away peacefully." I remembered that Grandfather Ada had simply fallen asleep one night and never awakened. How different a death from the man I'd seen gunned down in the street. Still, either way it was a frightening prospect. "Are you afraid to die, Papa?" I asked. Papa took a deep breath and let the air out slowly. "I'm in no hurry to leave you and your mother and all the people I love, but no, I wouldn't say I'm afraid exactly. I know where I'm going." "You'll climb the sunbeam up to heaven?" "Well," Papa paused to smile, "I don't know for certain how I'll get there. I only know that's where I'll end up." I pursed my lips and thought a moment. My eyes wandered to the window. The last darkness of the night was fading as morning began to rise. "Sometimes," I said, "it's hard to believe there's really such a place, and that we'll ever be there." "As strange as Earth might seem to someone not yet born," replied Papa, "but when we wake up in heaven, it will seem just as natural and familiar as waking up right here at home. Maybe more so, since that's where we really belong." "Do you think so, Papa? Do you think it will all be familiar when we get there?" "Yes, I think so." "But still, I'm glad to be here with you and Mama and Simon and Claudia and Molly." "I am too." "And I hope everything gets back to the way it was, before the strike and everything." "Things will be better soon." "And I hope Mama's bad feeling about Sioux City goes away." "Well, maybe if we could convince your mother to come to Sioux City with us sometime, she'd see there's nothing to be afraid of." "She'd never come." "Maybe not. Still, none of us needs to spend time fretting over things that haven't even happened. And now, young lady, you need to shut your eyes and try to get some sleep." "All right, Papa. I'll try." "Sleep well, then, Jenny." He turned toward the desk, adjusted the small lamp, and leaned over the open pages of the book. I gazed at his beloved figure across the room, wishing there was no other place than here, and no time other than this very moment. Chapter 20. Aunt Sally always said things happen in threes. If she broke one drinking glass, she was bound to break two more. If she pricked herself on her sewing needle while darning a sock, she was destined to suffer 2 additional wounds before the stitching was done. If she was gripped by a sneeze that left her ears ringing, 2 more explosive sneezes were sure to follow. While it was a rule that even Aunt Sally admitted had its occasional exceptions, it did seem to apply when it came to the men in our family getting whacked on the head. First, Uncle Jim had that patch of railroad track laid across his brow when his head collided with the billy club, and Dr. Hal had to stitch up the wound. Then my brother Simon stepped into the path of a flying rock that left him with a pretty cut on the side of his forehead. Finally, Cousin Rufus, in the midst of the riot, took a thump from an unseen assailant that raised a plum-sized knot on the back of his scalp. That thump also left him unconscious, and like Dr. Hal said, it was lucky he was rescued by the mill workers and carried off to the strike hospital rather than handcuffed by the police and hauled off to jail. So that was 3, and according to Aunt Sally's reasoning, I figured we were done with the whole mess and life would return to normal. It certainly seemed so, anyway. The only person unable to accept the fact that the mill workers were beat and the strike a lost cause was Rex Atwater. As stubborn as the proverbial mule, he refused to surrender even after the governor instituted martial law and continued to oversee the strike machine from his bed in the warehouse hospital. There were a number of mill workers who remained loyal to him. While Mr. Atwater and the union lawyer tried to get the injunction against picketing repealed, some of the men got around it by invoking their constitutional right to peaceable assembly. They showed up in front of the mill gates without signs and simply stood there, sometimes singing, sometimes talking quietly among themselves, deftly ignoring the National Guardsmen who patrolled our city streets with rifles and machine guns. In this way, the strike limped on for another week, but it was only a token demonstration. Thiel had no reason to pay attention to the men who continued to demand a union. His mill was running just fine without the men, and without the union. The mill was operating normally with a force made up partly of scabs and partly of former workers who had given up and returned to their jobs beyond the gates. Thiel, true to his word for once, accepted back all who wanted to return, at the same hours and wages as before the strike. When the former workers went in, word got out that Thiel had built up his workforce during the strike by smuggling men in on the same trains that hauled in the grain. "It was really so simple," Dr. Hal said when he learned of Thiel's scheme. "I can't believe I didn't think of that." Dr. Hal was still putting in time at the strike hospital, following up on the men as they recuperated after the final riot. It was there he learned about what was happening behind the scenes while the strikers were marching in front of the gates. The scabs, he explained to us later, that Thiel recruited to cross the picket line were only a front. It didn't really matter whether they got through the line or not, since Thiel was bringing the real workers in on the trains. Those scabs were brought around to the picket line just to get the strikers rioting. That was their whole job, and they were paid pretty well to do it. "But those men, those scabs, didn't they know they might get hurt? Killed even?" I asked, appalled. After all, I'd seen firsthand what happened when they tried to cross the line. "Sure they did," Dr. Hal replied, "but they figured a little money in their pockets was worth a beating." "But why, Dr. Hal?" I asked. "Why did Mr. Thiel want to start those riots?" "Because, Jenny, rioting means men will be wounded, and men will be arrested, and the more men out of the way, the less men on the picket line. That way, Thiel figured, he could undermine the strike, and he figured right." On the evening of Friday, September 9th, the strike finally ended with one last gasp and a long, drawn-out sigh when several hundred National Guardsmen, a battery of light artillery, and a detachment of machine gunners surrounded the warehouse that served as strike headquarters. The military stayed outside, while their colonel went in to meet with Rex Atwater and the other union organizers. The colonel asked that the warehouse be evacuated without resistance. Finally admitting defeat, the strike leaders, including Rex Atwater, allowed themselves to be taken into custody, while the remaining mill workers, members of the Women's Auxiliary, and other strike sympathizers who happened to be there at the time, broke rank and drifted off in various directions. After that, the city settled back into normalcy, and martial law was repealed. Some of the mill workers who stuck with Rex Atwater till the very end simply returned to their old jobs after his arrest. Others left the city in search of better opportunities elsewhere, though their prospects were questionable. Rumor had it that a few, disillusioned with capitalism after Thiel's victory, pledged allegiance to the Communist Party and devoted the rest of their lives to the revolution that never came. Uncle Jim and the others who had been arrested languished in jail because there was no money left in the strike coffers to bail them out. Again the rumor mill, working overtime, had it that the men would be slapped with long prison sentences. But we read in the newspapers that a trio of lawyers from the Grain Millers Union was pleading with the governor for leniency. Chances were good that our farmer labor governor, thinking ahead to the next election, would comply. It was men like those awaiting trial who would be voting him back into office. While waiting for the trial date to be set, Aunt Sally insisted I move back into my own bedroom. "Nonsense," Mother said. The three of us were in the kitchen canning tomatoes when my aunt offered me my room. "Where else would you sleep, Sally?" "I'll sleep on the couch in Will's study, where Jenny's sleeping now," Aunt Sally replied firmly. "You won't be comfortable there," Mother argued. "I can't sleep in that bed without Jim. Really, I prefer the couch." My heart gave a little leap for joy. I'd have my room back, my own place. I could sleep in my own bed and move my two Charlies back to the dresser mirror and again see the morning sun coming in through the windows. "Well, if that's really what you want," Mother conceded, "then all right, but you'll move back into Jenny's room when Jim comes home." Aunt Sally sighed as she wearily peeled tomatoes. "Who knows when that will be," she said quietly. And she was right. None of us knew. School started the following week, and while Charlotte and I walked to the schoolyard that first morning, I in my old shoes but wearing a new dress of my own making, I realized as I began my 8th year of education that I wasn't dreading the start of classes as I once had. Always before, even with the regimented schedule Mother imposed upon her children, summers had been a magical time, and I hated to see them end. It was with great reluctance that I would bid farewell to the warm, sunny days, to the exhilarating sense of freedom that came when I awoke and knew the whole day would be spent right there at home, away from school and lectures and tests and all the annoying social intricacies of cliques and, even at our young age, the wearisome rap-tap-tapping of the pecking order. At school, a person was always having to prove herself, her intelligence, her athletic ability, her social graces. but at home a person could just relax and be herself, because there was nothing to prove. She was accepted just because she had been born and she was family. But this summer everything had been different. Not the family, really, but things in the wider circle of life. Just as the sun, once a warm friend, had nearly crushed us with the full strength of its heat, the economy, once a prosperous ally, had trapped the country in its still crumbling structure and nearly left us all flattened in the dirt. I had seen those most affected by the times, the hungry down-and-outers in the soup line, the men and the families in Sioux City, the mill workers rioting outside the gates in a bid for higher wages and shorter working hours. I had seen a man die, shot in the back by one whose job in former days had been to protect him. No, it had been no ordinary summer, and though I knew I would continue to visit Sioux City at times with Papa, I was content to put the summer behind me and move forward. I could not pretend that none of it had happened. It had happened, all right, and the country and our city and my family, and I, would never quite be the same. We had all of us felt the heel of the Depression's boot pressing down on us, but I, for one, was ready to piece together the thread of my life that had been snipped in two by the summer, ready to go back to the place I had been before the summer began. I thought that in school, in the midst of the books, the chalk dust, the wooden desks with the names carved into the tops, I could regain a sense of order and well-being. Unlike other years, I was surprisingly ready to turn my attention to my studies, to my school friends, and, of course, for hope springs eternal in the human heart, to the pursuit of romance in whatever adolescent forms it might appear. I could not, however, continue to allow myself to be sweet on Danny Dysinger. His father was my uncle's enemy, and I had no business hoping for any sort of alliance, however innocent, with such a one as he. Already I had replaced him as prospect number 3 when Charlotte and I spun the globe. Should I pull number 3 from the jewelry box, I'd be honeymooning instead with Buster Keaton, at least until I could set my sights on some other boy at school. And if Danny tried to flirt with me between classes, and I was smugly certain that he would now that my hair was bobbed, I would simply have to stick up my nose and walk away. As it turned out, I needn't have come up with any such resolve. On the first day of school, and for many days afterward, Danny Dysinger paid no attention to me at all. He seemed to have forgotten we had shared a box lunch during the fundraiser for the Lower Street Mission. I was secretly hurt that he would forget so easily, and angry that I didn't have the opportunity to rebuff his advances. He left me with no means of dignity at all. I could only stare at him from across the room, feeling on the one hand as traitorous as Juliet in love with a member of the opposing tribe, and on the other hand as undesirable as Leah, whose husband Jacob threw fits of disgust when he discovered he'd been tricked into marrying her. After school that first day, I went home with Charlotte to do the globe and talk about the boys in our class. She had gained no more encouragement from Mitchell Quakenbush than I had from Danny Dysinger. "Like Mama says," Charlotte explained in a huff, "men are fickle. One day they tell you they love you, and the next they can't even remember your name." Not that Mitchell Quakenbush had ever told Charlotte he loved her. As far as I knew, he had never paid Charlotte any attention at all, hadn't even shared her box lunch at the fundraiser. But our imaginations were fertile in those days, and sometimes we confused our dreams with reality. "Well, let's spin the globe," Charlotte suggested. We spun, and found ourselves transported to the far corners of the earth with men who could do nothing less than pledge eternal devotion. My finger landed on Tahiti, or close enough, and from the jewelry box I pulled number 3. For the first time I found myself honeymooning with my substitute for Danny, Buster Keaton. Charlotte sailed off to the Mediterranean with Eddie Tolan, the Olympic runner to whom she'd lately taken a fancy. We sighed contentedly and began to rummage through the shoebox of cosmetics. We powdered our faces and darkened our eyelashes and rubbed lipstick over our lips. And suddenly, right in the middle of everything, I was struck by the overwhelming sense of the unreality of this game of make-believe in which I found myself a willing participant. I was playing the game because I had my whole future ahead of me, and I had the youth and the adolescent mindset to believe that my life should unfold just as I desired. But I had spent a whole summer pining over Danny Dysinger, only to have it come to nothing. And now I suddenly could see that dreams are dreams, and life is life, and that only too often the two bear little resemblance. The hand that held the tube of color to my lips paused in mid-air. "Charlotte," I said quietly, "do you think it'll ever really happen?" My friend must have been preoccupied with thoughts of sailing the Mediterranean, for it took her a moment to respond. "What?" she finally asked, reluctant to be pulled away from her visions. "Do I think what will ever happen?" "You know, the traveling, the excitement, the romance. Do you think it'll ever really happen?" "It better happen," Charlotte stated firmly, "or I'm going to kill myself." But I think that was the moment my one foot, still caught in childhood, made a definitive move over the line toward adulthood, because it was then I began to realize that life might very well turn out to be quite different from our dreams, and that happiness, too, might be something completely other than what we had always imagined it to be. Chapter 21. "Papa?" "Yes, Jenny?" "What is going to happen to Uncle Jim and Mr. Atwater and all those other men in jail?" Papa drove with his left elbow out the window. He glanced into the rearview mirror, then stretched his left arm straight out to let the driver behind us know we were turning. After a summer of such signaling, Papa's left arm was considerably darker than his right. When we'd made the turn, Papa said, "I can't say for sure, of course, but chances are some of them will serve prison sentences." "But why, Papa?" "Because rioting is a criminal offense. It's against the law. What makes it worse is that a couple of police and a deputy sheriff were killed." "But so were 5 mill workers. No, 6. One was killed in the first riot, remember?" Papa nodded. I continued, "Will the police who killed them go to prison, too?" "No, they won't go to prison. That's not considered murder, Jenny. The lawmen were only doing their job." "But that's not fair, Papa." "Well, it certainly doesn't seem fair, does it?" We were quiet for a moment. Then I asked, "Do you think Uncle Jim is one who'll serve a prison sentence?" "I can't say for sure," Papa repeated. "The union lawyers are working pretty hard on behalf of all the men in jail. It may be that they'll persuade Governor Borgman to be lenient. We can hope so, anyway." Uncle Jim had been locked up for 3 weeks now, and it seemed strange to have a relative behind bars. Jail was for criminals, and Jim Dubbin wasn't a criminal, no matter what the law said about rioting. Rioting hadn't been his intention. He had wanted only to make a better life for himself and for other working men. But somehow the plan had taken a turn for the worse, and Uncle Jim ended up where he didn't belong. We all missed him, but we didn't talk about him much. It was too painful. It was almost as if by not talking about him, we could pretend he wasn't in jail, that he'd be coming home any time now, that he'd walk through the front door with those great strides of his, just as he used to. The grown-ups visited him in jail, but Uncle Jim didn't want us children to see him there. Trying to remain optimistic, he said he'd see us when he got home. Aunt Sally always returned from these visits looking sad and wistful, but instead of talking about her husband, she'd say something like, "I wish Jimmy Jr. were here. Do you suppose he knows how much we miss him?" It was a Saturday afternoon near the end of September, and Papa and I were on our way to Sioux City. Mother still didn't approve of our visiting the shanty town, but relented without too much fuss whenever Papa said I was going with him. I think she still had her bad feeling, but I didn't hear her say as much. Before I could leave the house, though, I had to have my homework done, my piano practicing finished, and my chores completed. I had had a busy morning, but I didn't mind. I read my English lesson and figured my math problems at my own desk in my own room, where, curtains drawn back and windows thrown open wide, I paused occasionally to look for angels on the sunbeams slanting in. I'd seen none, and yet I wasn't disappointed. They must be there, I thought, because life was peaceful again. The strike was over. Uncle Jim was in jail, but I tried to look at the bright side, even of that. It was better than being dead. Aunt Sally, though still concerned about Uncle Jim's future, had stopped crying. The radio no longer played endlessly while we gathered anxiously about it, fanning ourselves with funeral parlor fans. Life had regained its composure, had evened out to a more easily navigable flow. Though I still saw the dying man in my dreams, I had gotten over some of the horror by recounting the event in detail to Charlotte. She was the only one, besides Simon and my cousins, who knew that I'd seen a man shot to death. Mother, Papa, and Aunt Sally had never asked about the riot. Maybe they'd been afraid to ask. If the boys ever spoke of it to them, I wasn't part of the conversation. And yet I needed to tell someone about the shooting, so I poured the scene into the listening ear of my friend. She was sympathetic, and needless to say, more than a little envious. "Wow, Virginia," she had said admiringly. You've lived." As we made our way to the shanty town, Papa whistled against the wind, cooler now that summer had passed. As usual, he whistled Christmas tunes, and even though we were no longer at the height of the summer heat, the notes of The First Noel still seemed out of place against the early autumn landscape. The trees were just beginning to succumb to fall colors, here a hint of red, there of yellow, and the first few leaves had begun spiraling to the ground. Each evening, when dusk settled in, we relished the refreshing night breezes, the forerunner of a colder season. It wasn't here yet, but the world hinted at its coming. In the back seat of the car lay 6 wool blankets, neatly folded. It wouldn't be long now before the folks in Sioux City would need to wrap themselves up against the frigid weather. Whenever I went to the camp, I handed out as many coverings as I could. Still, as men and even entire families came and went, there always seemed to be someone else who needed a blanket before winter. Listening to Papa whistle, I let my mind wander, and found it going around in circles from the riot, to school, to Danny Dysinger, to Charlotte, and back to the riot again. I wondered what Uncle Jim was doing to pass the time behind bars, and I wondered whether Mr. Atwater was sorry he hadn't become a shoe salesman or a railroad conductor or something equally as routine and safe. "Papa?" The whistling stopped. "Yes, Jenny?" "Why does Mr. Atwater keep trying to organize unions when he just gets beat up and shot and arrested?" A little smile of amusement formed on Papa's lips. "Well, because he's doing something he believes in. I'm sure he finds a certain satisfaction in it." "But he could get killed one of these days if he keeps getting shot at." "There's always that possibility, I suppose." Papa parked the car in our usual spot on the outskirts of Sioux City. Before we got out, I remarked, "I don't think unions are worth getting killed over." "It's all in how you see it, Jenny. To Mr. Atwater, it would probably be worth it. You see, it's not the unions that are so important to him, but the men who make up the unions. Mr. Atwater is making sacrifices for the people he cares about." I considered this a moment, then replied, "Still, if you ask me, I wouldn't die on purpose for anything." "It isn't easy, but many people do. Maybe not completely on purpose, but they take the risk. Soldiers die for their country. Martyrs die for their beliefs. Union organizers die for social justice. They allow their lives to be sacrificed for what they think is a greater cause." We got out of the car and opened the back door on either side. I took 3 of the blankets in my arms. We hadn't brought the wagon this time, while Papa grabbed the other 3, along with his medical bag. We walked past the Welcome to Sioux City sign. I still hadn't decided whether that sign was blasphemous or not, but over the months as I saw people come and go, I had come to appreciate their illegal dependence upon the Sioux line. If they didn't hop the trains, how would they get from here to there in search of opportunity? The soles of their shoes were too thin to carry them to all the places where those great train wheels were rolling every day. As we sauntered through the orderly squalor of the shantytown, I thought about Papa's words. The mill workers who died in the riot, in a way they were martyrs, weren't they? Papa, shifting his medical bag from one hand to the other beneath the bulky blanket, said, "Not everyone would think so, but yes, they certainly died for what they believed in." Then maybe that's better than dying in a plain old accident, or just of old age. The poets might hail it as more noble, I guess. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hunt, Mrs. Conley," Papa said, greeting the 2 women who were washing dishes together outside Mrs. Hunt's shanty. Ever since Roy Conley had settled his family into the camp a short time before, Mrs. Conley and Mrs. Hunt had become inseparable. I thought it particularly nice that Mrs. Hunt had found a friend. Now she had someone to visit with all the time. The women greeted us, saying they were happy to see that the blanket brigade had returned. Papa asked them how their children were, and they assured him all were fine. I didn't see Layla around anywhere, and was thankful for it. She and her questions had a way of making me nervous. Papa and I walked on. "Even if it's a more noble way to die," I said, picking up on the thread of our conversation, "I hope I don't ever have to be a martyr." Papa let go a swift chuckle. "I wouldn't put that on the top of your list of worries right now," he remarked. There were a couple of new men in the camp that Papa wanted to visit first. He'd met them earlier in the week, and one of them was suffering attacks of asthma. But before we could hunt them down, we came across Dick Mason sitting alone in a Sioux City lawn chair in front of his shanty. He was reading a day-old newspaper while an unlit cigarette butt dangled listlessly from his lower lip. When he saw Papa, he folded the newspaper and waved us over. "Pull up a brick," he invited. "I've got to talk with you, Doc." Papa put the blankets and his bag just inside the door of Mr. Mason's shanty, then upended a couple of cinder blocks for the two of us to sit on. Dick Mason shook Papa's hand and tipped his weathered fedora at me. "Got news for you, Doc," he began. "It may mean something, or it may mean nothing at all. I don't know. But Mr. Jones has got himself a sidekick, a fellow by the name of Ernie Armstrong. The two of them have been working overtime trying to get the men to stage a hunger strike down in front of City Hall." Papa's eyes narrowed behind his glasses. "A hunger strike?" "One of the missions downtown has run out of money and is no longer giving out food. That was one of the places the men were dependent on for a square meal, and last week it had to shut its doors," explained Mr. Mason. He hadn't removed the cigarette butt, and it flapped between his lips as he spoke. "Of course, there's a couple of other bread lines still moving, but the men are afraid the same thing will happen there. We all know those bread lines are depending on charity, and when all you've got between you and starvation is another man's generosity, you know you're skating on thin ice. Now Jones and Armstrong are squawking about how it's the federal government's job to take care of us, and the government's not lifting a ringed pinky on our behalf. They say Hoover would just as soon let us starve as use federal funds to feed us, which I suppose is true. I've never been a Hoover man myself, and you can be sure I'll be backing Roosevelt in the next election. Anyway, Doc, the men are hungry, and to tell you the truth, they're more scared than ever. They're scared for themselves, and they're scared for their families." Papa sat forward with his arms on his thighs, his fingers laced between his knees. "I don't suppose the strike down at the mill did much for their morale, either." Dick Mason shook his head and spat the butt out onto the ground. I imagined it was something he'd never done at home in front of his wife before the depression had turned him into a temporary drifter. "The men are—" He started to use an expletive, but remembering my presence, he cleared his throat and started again. "The men are plenty angry about it. Some of them were on the picket line, you know." Papa nodded. "Every man in Sioux City was on the side of the strikers, and they took the loss personally. Long John came back from that last riot, but Ross Knutson and George Samuelson are both behind bars. Yeah, the men are pretty sore about it all, and for Jones and Armstrong it's just given them more fuel for the fire. See how the government treats its workers, they say. See where capitalism has gotten you." Mr. Mason paused to fumble around in his shirt pocket for another cigarette. He didn't have a pack of them. Rather, he drew out 3 that had already been smoked to some extent and picked out the longest one. I decided he must have picked them up off the street in town. I shivered as he lighted the tobacco with the last match and a dog-eared matchbook, imagining the dirt the man had just placed between his lips. He continued, "If you're going to be a Red, now's the time, I guess. If I didn't know better, I'd say the time was ripe for a revolution. I don't really think it'll happen, but those who want to believe in it have got good reason. Things have never been worse for the capitalist." Papa squeezed his fingers together, then cupped his knees with the palms of his hands. "No use worrying about a communist takeover because it's not going to happen," he stated flatly. "Anyway, that's the larger picture. What we have to be concerned about is the smaller picture, that is, what's happening right here. What do you think the chances are, Dick, that there'll be a hunger strike?" Dick Mason took the cigarette out of his mouth and scratched his forehead with his thumbnail. "I frankly think chances are good," he confessed, "judging from the atmosphere around here lately." "Have any definite plans been made for a strike?" Mr. Mason shrugged his shoulders while taking a long drag of the cigarette. The smoke came out while he spoke. "I'm not sure, but I don't think so. The scary thing is, where once the men weren't willing to give Jones the time of day, now they're starting to listen to him. That's what hunger and anger will do to you. Suddenly a man doesn't have the same convictions he had when he was comfortable, and the Reds know how to take advantage of that. Mr. Mason smoked quietly while Papa rubbed the back of his neck with a handkerchief. I rocked casually on the cinder block while watching a couple of scrawny chickens strut their way across Hoover Avenue. The lack of meat on their bones was probably what kept the birds alive. They weren't worth the effort to kill, pluck, and cook. All down Hoover Avenue, the usual group of men sat in their doorways, smoking. Some, like Dick Mason, read outdated newspapers to stay in touch with a world to which they no longer belonged. Other men squatted around small fires, warming their predictable lunches of canned beans. I heard a baby cry, and knew it must be Caroline Everhart. From somewhere across the dusty avenues, the sound of singing reached us. The Sioux City Trio was at it again. They were still waiting for the Sioux line to bring them back their banjo player. So far he hadn't shown up. In the distance a train whistle blew, and I thought, maybe there's the banjo player now. One never knew. I heard what Papa and Dick Mason were saying, but somehow it stirred up little concern on my part. Papa said there'd be no communist takeover, and if Papa said it, then that was that. I was tired of worrying about the communists. I was tired of worrying, period. And I just wasn't going to do it anymore. The worst was behind us now. Things were still bad in Sioux City, but they were better for my family, and that was what mattered to me at this point. We'd done our bit for social injustice. The requisite number of males in my family had taken their lumps on the head, and now it was time for us to get back to enjoying life as much as possible. I admit I felt more than a little selfish, but all the anxious days beside the radio had left me worn out. Of course I was sorry the mission had closed and the people of Sioux City had one less resource for food. That being the case, I wasn't so sure a hunger strike was a bad thing. Why shouldn't the men make a show on the steps of City Hall to let the government know they were hungry? Nothing was bound to happen otherwise, not if they just sat around here smoking cigarettes and reading yesterday's news. And just because the grain mill strike had failed didn't mean a hunger strike would fail. I wasn't on the side of the Reds, but obviously something needed to be done. If the men of Sioux City chose to voice their complaints on the steps of City Hall, I'd hope for the best for them. But I didn't want to get emotionally involved. It had nothing to do with me. Or so I thought. Chapter 22. For a moment I thought the sun had gone to my head, and I was seeing things the way a nomad dying of thirst sees a mirage in the middle of the desert. After all, it was one of those unusually hot days in late September, and our class had already been out in the heat for more than half an hour. In another 10 minutes the bell would ring to call us in from recess, but by then, if what I was seeing were in fact a figment of my own making, surely I'd be nearly prostrate with sunstroke. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the vision didn't fade. Danny Dysinger, his hands in his pants pockets, was strolling purposefully across the school grounds, and he was heading in the direction of where I sat with Charlotte and 2 other girls. Tagging Danny like a shadow was Philip Mesner, a scrawny, nasal kid who was forever trying to prove his manhood by following the bigger boys around and thrusting himself into the midst of whatever argument, debate, or fistfight they might happen to get into. Philip had been known to run half the length of the school to jump on top of 2 boys wrestling in the hall, just to pick up a few bruises he could wear like a medal of valor. He had a way of sniffing out the action, and if he was trailing Danny, if in fact Danny was really there, that meant something was up. My friends and I sat on a patch of brittle grass, discussing the movie Love is a Racket with Douglas Fairbanks, Jr. Even though I'd spent my allowance on the trolley to get to the grain mill, Papa later slipped me enough under the table so that I could go to the picture with Charlotte as planned. We were debating about whether love really was a racket when Rosemary patted my knee and said, "Say, Danny Dysinger's headed this way. What do you suppose he wants?" So it was true. Rosemary had seen it too, and now Charlotte and Jean both shielded their eyes from the sun and stared off in the direction from which came Danny Dysinger and his slightly asthmatic shadow. Suddenly Charlotte swung around and looked at me with raised eyebrows. "He's actually going to say something to you, Virginia," she whispered. "Maybe he's going to ask you out." My resolve to no longer be sweet on Danny Dysinger was easier said than done. As he approached us, a sudden fear whirled in my chest, and I thought I might faint. The thought flashed through my mind that I'd never live it down if I fainted right there in front of everybody. I grabbed my skirt with both hands to ground myself in the conscious world and said in response to Charlotte's remark, "Oh, I don't think so." But before I could say more, Danny was there, kicking at the dry grass with the toe of one leather shoe and smiling down at us with an insincere grin. "Having a party?" he asked, pushing his hands farther down into his pockets. "I mean, with a capital P, that is." Philip Mesner snickered and snorted, though he probably had no more idea of what Danny was talking about than we did. He aped Danny by thrusting his hands into his pockets and kicking at the ground. A tuft of grass got caught between the sole and the toe of his shoe, but he didn't notice. I looked up longingly into Danny's face. It was difficult to believe that this good-looking boy had come from the likes of Clem Dysinger. Not a hint of the father marred the son's appearance. Where the sheriff was overweight and doughy, Danny was slender and lithe. While the sheriff's face hung heavy as a hound dog's, Danny's was sleek and narrow like a greyhound's. The sheriff was a colorless fellow, with wishy-washy hair and nondescript eyes, but Danny's hair and brows and eyes were a deep brown, the color of maple wood that's been smoothed and polished. The features of his face were well-proportioned, wide-set eyes, narrow nose, a pleasant, inviting mouth that revealed perfect teeth when he smiled. I knew the face well. Its portrait had hung on the wall of my mind for months, and now here it was in the flesh. But the taunting look on the face that hovered above me was hardly in keeping with my dreams. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "What on earth are you talking about, Danny?" she asked sharply. "Oh, don't you know?" he replied with mock politeness, the grin on his face melting into an undeniable sneer. "Know what?" Rosemary put one small fist on her hip as a gesture of defiance. Danny nodded down at me and stated flatly but accusingly, "Jenny's father is a communist." "Yeah, he's a communist," Philip echoed. He snorted again. My friends and I squawked in unison, I loudest of all. I jumped to my feet and clenched my hands into fists. "What do you mean calling my father a communist?" I cried. Charlotte jumped up beside me. "Start explaining," she yelled. My best friend's face was nearly as red as my own. Danny Dysinger was unperturbed. He shrugged nonchalantly. "My pa says yours is a commie. Says your uncle is, too, and Dr. Bellamy, too. He says the whole lot of you are blood-sucking Reds." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and coming from the boy I had spent all summer dreaming about. "That's a lie!" I was so angry I was trembling. Charlotte tapped on Danny's chest with 2 fingers. "You better take that back, Danny Dysinger, or you'll be sorry." Danny laughed outright. "What you gonna do, beat me up? I'm not gonna fight a girl." "Fight a girl," Philip echoed. Spittle flew from his mouth as he laughed. Rosemary and Jean were both on their feet by now, muttering threats about having older brothers who would gladly do them a favor. Danny Dysinger was only amused. "What you mad at me for? I'm only telling it like it is." "Yeah, he's just telling it like it is," Philip said. Charlotte turned to the offensive follower. "Oh, you shut up, Philip Mesner, you stinky little sewer rat." "Hey!" Philip cried, but Danny quieted him with a wave of his hand. "Don't let them bother you, Phil," Danny said. "They just can't face the truth." "It's not the truth," I countered. "My father is not a communist." "Then why is he spending all his time down at that squatters' camp? He's not getting paid, is he?" "No, but—" "Then he's doing it because he's a Red." "He's not. He's doing it because—" I paused, unable to continue. Why was Papa doing what he was doing? Why did he go to Sioux City? "Simply because," Papa had told me, "it makes me happy." Not for any noble reasons, he had said, but just because it made him happy. But what would that mean to Danny Dysinger and his sewer rat sidekick? If I told them what Papa had said, the boys would only laugh all the harder. I finished lamely. "Just because my father goes down to the camp, well, it doesn't mean anything." "My pa says it does," Danny continued. "He says those poor people ain't paying him, but maybe Moscow is." Charlotte shrieked with feigned laughter. "Now that's so stupid it's downright funny." "Nobody's paying him," I threw in. "He's just doing it." "Nobody does something for nothing," Danny said. "Yeah," Philip added. "I bet Moscow's paying him." "Oh, why don't you just crawl back to where you came from?" Charlotte suggested. "Hey!" "It's not just what he's been doing down at the camp," Danny said, ignoring Philip's attempt at self-defense. My pa says he was down helping out at the strike hospital, too. Everyone knows the strike was started by the Reds. It said so right in the newspaper. If your pa was on the side of the strikers, he was on the side of the Reds. It was getting more and more difficult not to swing my already clenched fist at Danny. His rejection of me was bad enough, but his spreading lies about Papa was too much. It was the worst thing he could possibly do. I found myself screaming at the top of my lungs, "Your father's a liar!" My outburst turned heads all over the schoolyard, but I didn't care. Everything within me wanted to defend my father, no matter the cost. To my continued frustration, Danny remained complacent. "My pa only calls him like he sees him," he said mildly. "Yeah?" Charlotte said. "Well, your father's calling this one wrong. Besides, he's a rotten sheriff, and my father said he wouldn't vote for your father next election if the only other person running was Al Capone." "Hey," Philip whined, "you gonna let her talk about your pa like that, Danny?" Danny once again shrugged his shoulders annoyingly. "What do I care what she thinks about my pa?" Then, looking at me, he concluded, "At least my pa's not a Red." That did it. Though I couldn't see straight for the tears that were blurring my vision, I nevertheless swung my fist in Danny's direction, only to end up sweeping the air. Danny must have seen it coming, because he stepped back and held up his hands. "Whoa," he said. "I didn't come here to start a fight." "Well, what did you come here for?" Charlotte cried. "Why don't you both just go on and leave us alone?" As Rosemary and Jean joined Charlotte in throwing out words to defend me, I willed the tears in my eyes not to spill over onto my cheeks. But my will wasn't enough to keep the teardrops from slipping out and trickling down the side of my nose. I hastily wiped away the evidence of my humiliation and my broken heart. And as I did, I glanced in Danny's direction to convince myself that he hadn't noticed my tears. To my surprise, the mask of smugness on his face had been replaced by something very similar to concern, and Danny started to say, "Aw, Jenny, I didn't think—" But Charlotte cut him off with a shove to the chest and the warning, "Just leave her alone, you big bully, or I'll make you sorry you were ever born." Good old Charlotte. I could always count on her to stand up for me, even if it meant threatening a member of the stronger sex. I had no idea how Charlotte would make Danny sorry he'd been born, but no doubt she could pull it off somehow. Just as my friends and I turned away from the boys, the bell called us all in from recess. Charlotte saddled up beside me and put her arm around my shoulder. "Good thing you already picked someone else for number 3, she said. "I wouldn't send my worst enemy on a honeymoon with that creep." I sighed forlornly. All summer long I had wanted Danny to pay attention to me, to talk with me once school started up, and now when he did, it was only to insult my father. Again I was reminded, in the cruelest of ways it seemed, how very different real life turns out to be than what we dreamed. Sniffing loudly and wiping one last tear from my cheek, I asked, "Did your father really say that about Al Capone?" "Nah," Charlotte said, shaking her head, "but you can be sure he won't vote for Sheriff Dysinger next election, not if I have any say about it." I wanted to tell Charlotte she was a good friend, the best of friends, but I knew she'd only be embarrassed and shrug it off. Instead, I swung my arm up over her shoulder, and entwined like 2 vines of the ivy that climbed up the school's brick facade, we walked on to class. But disappointment hadn't finished with us yet. After school, I walked home with Charlotte, where we found the latest issue of Life magazine on a table with the other mail in the hallway. Charlotte dropped her school books on the table, scooped up the magazine, and said, "The contest results should be in this issue. Come on." I followed her up the stairs, our shoes tapping out a hurried rhythm on the steps. From the kitchen, Mrs. Bessick wailed, "Try to be a little less noisy, will you? I've got a pounding headache." But completely unsympathetic toward her ailment, we ignored her. All we could think about was the vast amount of money soon to cross our palms. We threw ourselves onto Charlotte's bed, and my friend then licked one thumb and hurriedly flipped through the pages of the magazine. "Here it is," she hollered excitedly. As her eyes moved down the page of contest winners, she muttered her father's name over and over. "Luther Bessick, Luther Bessick." "Do you see it?" I asked. I held both hands in the air with fingers crossed. "Not yet," she said. "Luther Bessick, Luther Bessick. Come on, you've got to be here somewhere." She turned the page. Then she slowly lowered the magazine to the bed as her eyes moved up to my face. I gave her a questioning look, unwilling to uncross my fingers and drop my hands. "Did you see his name?" I asked tentatively. "It's not here." Charlotte spoke the words breathlessly, as though she couldn't quite believe it. "You mean we didn't win anything? Not even $5 lousy. I let my hands drop to the bed. For a moment neither of us said anything. "But it was a good slogan," I groaned. I felt like crying again. There would be no crisp greenbacks for me to present to Mother, and no new patent leather shoes for me to show off at school. And I had been so sure. Charlotte, muttering something about it being a stupid contest anyway, flung the magazine across the room. "Let's do the globe," she suggested, swinging her feet off the bed and grabbing the globe from the vanity table. Then pulling the jewelry box out of the drawer, she brought both it and the magic orb back to the bed. Charlotte twirled one of her short curls around her index finger. "Go on, you spin first, but I just hope you don't land in the Dead Sea again this time," she said, referring to where I'd landed the day before. "It's really hard to be romantic when you're floating around the Dead Sea." I spun, but without enthusiasm. I might as well end up in the Dead Sea the way I felt. If not even Danny Dysinger was a part of my life, then what did Charles Lindbergh, Charlie Chaplin, and Buster Keaton have to do with me? Why should I dream of winging off to some exotic place to honeymoon with them? None of them even knew I was alive. Suddenly spinning the globe seemed a ridiculous game, a childish game. I laid a hand across my stomach, moaned slightly, and mumbled that I wasn't feeling well. Charlotte, not wanting me to be sick all over her frilly pink and white bedspread, suggested that I go on home. I did, but instead of entering the front door of our house, I entered the side door that led directly into Papa's waiting room. Fortunately, no one was there, and I sat down in one of the empty chairs. If anyone found me, like Mother, I decided I would say I was checking the blanket box for donations. Of course I wasn't really. I just wanted to be near Papa. He was in the inner office, perhaps checking the supplies in the medicine cabinet or reviewing some paperwork. I didn't know. But he was there. I could hear him whistling Christmas carols beyond the adjoining door. I sat in the waiting room for about 10 minutes listening. That was all I needed to believe again that life was good and happiness possible. Chapter 23. We didn't know about the Hunger March until the morning after it happened. We might have learned about it the previous evening had we bothered to turn on the radio, but we were no longer so keen to listen to that bearer of bad news. Even with the strike over, we were wary of the Philco and kept our distance from it for a while. The march had taken place more than 12 hours earlier, and some of the men from Sioux City had already spent their first night in jail before Papa read the news account in the morning paper over breakfast. Papa and Dr. Howe sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table, each with a section of the newspaper spread open before him. I was the only other one at the table enjoying the pancakes and molasses. Mother and Aunt Sally both puttered about the kitchen, preparing for one of the last canning days of the season. Since it was Saturday, Claudia, Molly, and the boys hadn't bothered to get out of bed yet. Dr. Howe was biding his time with the sports page until he could get his hands on the section Papa was reading. Before leaving the table, he would have to have his daily dose of Walter Lippmann. As I mentioned, Dr. Howe had a fondness for reading aloud from Lippmann's column, thereby punctuating our morning with news of how much deeper into the depression our country had sunk. Whenever Dr. Howe blurted out, "Hey, listen to this," I'd immediately try to set my mind on something else so as not to fall into a depression myself. But this morning it wasn't Dr. Howe who read to us from the newspaper. It was Papa. He had just raised his coffee cup to his lips when his eyebrows rose above the rims of his glasses, and he said quietly, "So they've done it." He set the coffee cup back in the saucer without drinking. Dr. Howe looked up from the sports section. "Done what?" he asked. "Dick Mason said the communists were trying to organize a hunger march at City Hall, and he was right. They marched yesterday afternoon. I can't believe we didn't get wind of it somehow." "Should have listened to the news last night," Dr. Howe said. "I would have if I hadn't been called out. You get too busy and you start to lose track of what's going on." Yes, I thought, and the same thing happens if you're just too scared to know. Mother turned from the sink to cast Papa a dubious look. "Do you mean to say communists were able to organize a protest?" Papa nodded. "There have been a couple of men trying to set up an unemployed council for some months now. Looks like they succeeded. According to this article, about 300 men and women showed up at City Hall saying they were hungry and demanding relief. Not all from Sioux City, were they? Dr. Hal asked. Couldn't have been, Papa said, sticking out his lower lip. No doubt some of them were from the shanty town, but they must have gotten people from all over the city to join them. Papa, I piped up, how come Mr. Mason didn't tell you it was going to happen? You told him to let you know if there was going to be a march. He's been gone for the past week, though he's supposed to return today. He found temporary work just over the border in Wisconsin. But even if you'd known about the march, Dr. Hal interjected, what could you have done about it? Papa shrugged. I don't suppose I could have done much of anything. You can't stop 300 hungry people. Mother sounded slightly exasperated when she asked, so what happened? More violence, I suppose, said Aunt Sally, who had been quiet until now. Papa nodded again as his eyes scanned the article. Says here, a delegation of unemployed, led by John Jones, alleged head of the Unemployed Council, demanded of City Manager Thomas Symington that the authorities furnish immediate relief for the men and their families. Jones rejected a request by Mr. Symington for the names and addresses of the members of the Unemployed Council. Jones and the delegation returned to the marchers, a group of some 300 men and women, and excited the crowd with anti-government rhetoric. From City Hall they led the crowd on a raid of two businesses on nearby 3rd Avenue, Elkton's Grocers and Owensby Bakery. The owner of the bakery, Owen Owensby, suffered a broken arm when he was attacked as he drew a revolver and attempted to keep out the angry demonstrators. The shelves of the grocery store and the bakery were stripped of their goods, and windows in both establishments were broken. Local police hastily assembled an emergency squad and dispersed the crowd with tear gas. 37 men who were trapped in the wrecked stores were arrested. 6 women were released. Among those arrested were John Jones and Ernie Armstrong. The police said Armstrong was one of the speakers who harangued the crowd at City Hall before the demonstrators descended on the stores. When he finished reading, Papa folded the newspaper and lifted his shoulders in a sigh. Mother asked wearily of no one in particular, "Will it ever end?" Papa tossed the paper across the table to Dr. Hal and said, "I guess I'll find out more this afternoon when I make my rounds at Sioux City." I took a sip of milk, then leaned toward my father and asked quietly so that Mother wouldn't hear, "Can I go with you, Papa?" I should have known it was no use. Mother heard, and answering for Papa, replied firmly in the negative. "No, you may not go, Virginia. Certainly not today after what's just happened at City Hall." "But, Mama—" "I said no, young lady, and that's final." It was just as well. I was supposed to go to the movies with Charlotte in the afternoon, and she'd be cross with me if I backed out. She'd been waiting all week to see Lowell Sherman in What Price Hollywood. Lately Charlotte had been thinking about becoming a movie star, and she thought the show might give her some ideas on how to break into film. As for Sioux City, Papa could tell me everything when he got back, if there was anything to tell. Both Papa and Dr. Hal got up from the table without asking for a second helping of pancakes. Dr. Hal must have lost his appetite for Walter Lippmann as well, because he left the newspaper on the table where Papa had tossed it. I spent the morning doing chores, working on my school lessons, and practicing the piano. After lunch, Charlotte came by so we could walk together to the theater. Her father was out of town again, and her mother, though always ready with an opinion about the times, didn't in fact pay much attention to the news, so I knew Charlotte probably hadn't heard about the Hunger March. "You mean a bunch of Reds busted up a couple of stores downtown?" she asked when I told her what Papa had read in the paper that morning. "Yeah, a grocery store and a bakery." "On 3rd Avenue?" "I think that's right. You know, Elkton's Grocers and Owensby Bakery." "I've been to both those places 1,000,000 times," Charlotte cried. She quickened her pace. "Come on, let's go see how busted up they are." Charlotte took off running, and I called out, "But what about the movie?" "We can miss the cartoon in the newsreel. This is important." I hurried to catch up with my curiosity-seeking friend. We sprinted toward downtown until we arrived panting at 3rd Avenue. A policeman, his hands clasped together behind his back, lingered in front of the grocery store. He paced the sidewalk, stopping momentarily to glance from the wrecked grocery store to the ravaged bakery across the street. Then, satisfied that both places were free of looters, he continued pacing. Pedestrians walking past the stores, taken aback by the destruction, stopped, shook their heads, talked among themselves, and exchanged comments with the policeman before moving on. Even cars slowed as they passed by in the street, the occupants fairly hanging their heads out the open windows to get a better view. More than once the policeman had to blow his whistle and wave the traffic on to prevent a backup on 3rd Avenue. Charlotte and I paused a few yards from the policeman and gaped at the broken windows. Someone had swept up the glass on the sidewalk, but a few small shards remained, glittering in the sun. We timidly approached the grocery store to peer in through what was left of the plate glass window. Peaks of glass pointed upward from the bottom frame of the window and downward from the top, reaching toward each other like the columns of stalactite and stalagmite in an underground cavern. Through the hole we saw the aisles of the store strewn with debris, wilted vegetables heaped upon splattered fruit, canned goods scattered amid broken glass bottles. 2 men, appearing to us like shadowy figures from where we stood in the sunlight, moved about inside, cleaning up. Wide-eyed, Charlotte and I gazed in disbelief at the mess. So, I marveled, there really are communists in this city, and here is the evidence of their existence. All the while the strike at the grain mill had been going on, the communists had been a kind of nebulous group to blame, a smokescreen for the real issues at hand. Surely patriotic, freedom-loving Americans wouldn't pull a stunt like that, it was thought. Oh no, only communists would call a strike and talk about workers' rights. It was kind of like the kid blaming the mess in his room on goblins or elves, on something that doesn't really exist. But these 2 wrecked stores, was the work of the commies. The goblins were real. They hadn't had anything to do with the grain mill strike, but nevertheless they were real, and they were busy. The silence into which Charlotte and I had settled was interrupted by the policeman. "All right, girls," he said, not unkindly. "You've seen all there is to see. Move along now." Like a couple of dumb sheep, we obeyed, making our way along 3rd Avenue to the theater a few blocks east. We paid our quarters and sat through the movie, but after viewing the destruction of the Hunger March, even Charlotte thought the picture somewhat dull and unreal in comparison. When Papa got home that evening, I asked him what he'd found out at Sioux City. He said that of the 300 marchers, less than 50 had been from Sioux City, and only a half-dozen of those arrested were from the shantytown. "No one you know," Papa told me, "though you may have seen some of them once or twice." I asked him about Steele O'Neill, Shoes, Mr. Lucky, Sherman Brown, Long John, the 3 musicians, everyone I could think of, and he assured me they were all fine. None of them had been involved in the Hunger March. Dick Mason had returned from Wisconsin, and after taking inventory, told Papa that the men who'd ended up in jail were rascals anyway, and Sioux City was better off without them. With Jones and Armstrong out of the picture, Papa predicted happily, life should be much quieter for everyone from now on. My father was a smart man, and made us all feel better with his words of assurance. But as it turned out, he was not a very good barometer of things to come. Chapter 24. Charlotte and I usually walked home from school together, but after the last bell on Monday, she headed downtown on an errand for her mother, and I was left to walk home alone. But I didn't mind too much. The autumn leaves were dropping from the trees, and I enjoyed listening to their swishing and crunching as I strolled through the mat of crisp colors on the sidewalk. It was a music I could never quite hear over Charlotte's chatter. I wasn't walking, really, but rather shuffling, barely lifting the soles of my shoes from the sidewalk so as to produce the loudest swish-swish possible from the leaves. The noise was delightful, and I almost started to whistle along with it, as Papa would have done, except that I was interrupted by someone calling my name. "Jenny? Hey, Jenny, wait up!" To my great surprise, and even greater horror, I recognized the voice of Danny Dysinger. Not bothering to turn around, I continued walking and swishing all the louder. Ignoring him gave me a deep sense of satisfaction, but the feeling was short-lived. Danny Dysinger was not one to be easily put off. He came panting up behind me and tugged at the shoulder of my dress, saying, "Jenny, are you deaf or something? I said wait up." I pulled my shoulder away briskly, as if I'd been shocked by static electricity. "My name's Virginia," I stated firmly, "and what do you want?" My mouth had suddenly gone dry, and the last word rolled clumsily off my tongue. "Listen," he said, "I didn't mean to make you sore the other day. I wish you wouldn't hold it against me." Giving him my wildest stare of disbelief, I responded, "You call my father a communist and expect me not to get mad?" Danny belched out something between a laugh and a guffaw. "Oh, Jenny," he explained, "it was just a joke." My eyebrows jumped up toward my hairline. "Some joke?" I cried. "Oh, I didn't mean nothing by it." I shook my head and walked on. I was still sweet on Danny, and there was no denying it, but I couldn't bring myself to accept his fumbling apology. Still not ready to give up, though, he tugged again at my shoulder. "Oh, Jenny." "Virginia," I hissed. All right, Virginia, then. Listen, I'm trying to tell you I didn't mean nothing by it." Lifting my chin half an inch higher, I argued, "It's your father's fault my uncle's in jail. My Uncle Jim's a good man, and your pa put him where he doesn't belong." "My pa was only doing his job," Danny countered. "Any sheriff would have had to go out there and arrest the strikers." "Maybe so," I said, "but just because your father's the sheriff doesn't mean he can go around calling people names. Your father said my father and my uncle and Dr. Hal were all Reds, didn't he? He said those awful things, and it's not true." "Yeah," Danny admitted, sounding sheepish. "He said it, but I know it ain't true. I know your pa's not a Red, and not your uncle or Doc Bellamy neither." "Then why did you say it?" "I don't know, Virginia. You can be sore if you want, but listen, I gotta tell you something. Something important." He paused. I waited for him to go on, but he didn't. "So what is it?" I asked stonily, adding a heavy sigh to accentuate my contempt. Danny took a deep breath, and I noticed his chest quivered nervously. His lips puckered a moment, as though he were trying hard to spit the words out. Finally he said, "I heard my pa talking with some men yesterday. They didn't know I was outside the door, but I was, and I heard everything." I let the feigned contempt drop from my voice. Danny had captured my curiosity. "Yeah?" I asked. "So what did they say?" "They said the hunger riot was on account of the people down at the shanty town. They said those tramps were responsible for busting up the grocery store and that bakery." "That's not true," I cried. "Most of those people that rioted weren't from the shanty town." "I'm just telling you what I heard," Danny said defensively. "My pa said those tramps are vermin that need to be got rid of for the good of the city. He said the shanty town is really a red village, a miniature Moscow, sitting right there on the banks of the river. So my pa and his men, they're going to run them out, Jenny. They're going to run them out and burn the camp down. They're going to do it tonight after dark." Stopping abruptly, I stared at Danny in horror. My heart pumped wildly, and my limbs became so weak I thought I might drop the books clutched in my arms if my knees didn't buckle beneath me first and leave me in a heap on the sidewalk. "Danny Dysinger," I asked quietly, "are you telling me the truth?" "I swear, Jenny," he said solemnly. His walnut-colored eyes were wide and fearful, almost pleading. "That's what I heard them say." Hurriedly he added, "Listen, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you got to warn them. But it's too late. Paul's already got some of his men posted down there at the camp disguised as tramps. 3 deputies wandered into the camp this morning, looking like all the other bums down there. They're all riled up and just aching for action, Jenny, and I'm telling you they won't act kindly toward anyone who tries to interfere." Danny paused and looked at me long and hard for a moment. "I know your pa goes down to the camp a lot to help out, but I'm giving you a fair warning. Don't let him go down there tonight. Make sure he stays home. What's going to happen down there ain't going to be a pretty sight." I was momentarily stunned into silence, but finally I managed to mumble, "You can't let your pa do this, Danny. He's got it all wrong. Those people in the camp, they're good people. You have to stop him, Danny." Danny shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "I can't stop him, Jenny. He and his men, they've made up their minds. You got to understand." His words trailed off, and a look of helplessness crossed his face. Suddenly I did understand. Danny was afraid of his father. He knew his father was doing something wrong, but Danny felt incapable of confronting him, and so he was trying to have some influence over the situation in the only way he knew how, by telling me. And now that the burden had been passed to me, I was equally staggered by its weight. Without another word to Danny, I turned and ran, half stumbling, my legs limp with fear. Behind me I heard Danny call out my name, "Ginny! Ginny!" But I didn't stop, and I didn't even turn my head to look. Breathless, gasping for air, my books heavy and awkward against my chest, I ran, feet pounding recklessly on the sidewalk. Tears stung my eyes until I was half blind, and I moved through the dizzy streets by instinct, like a homing pigeon. When I reached our house at last, I flew through the front door, pulled myself up the stairs with the help of the banister, and flung myself across my bed. My schoolbooks went soaring through the air and landed on the floor with a thump that alerted Mother. In the next moment she came to my room and settled her ample body on my bed, where I lay weeping. Though I didn't lift my face from my arms, I felt the bed sag to one side with her weight, and just the sense of her presence was comforting. "Why, Virginia," she said, sounding almost startled, but her voice was laced with a soft note of compassion. "What on earth are you crying about?" She reached out one hand and patted my tangled hair. I longed to lie there beneath her soothing touch and tell her everything, shifting the weight of Danny's warning over onto her strong shoulders. But I couldn't tell her, of course. There was no question about that. Neither could I simply say it was nothing. One didn't throw herself across the bed weeping for no reason. I hated to do it, but I would have to lie. Lifting my tear-streaked face from my arms, I said, "I didn't do well on my lessons today, Mama." Mother almost laughed, but it came out more like a chuckle. "Well, for heaven's sake, Virginia," she replied, the note of compassion becoming a flat chord of amusement. "You don't have to get so upset over something like that. It's not the end of the world. We all have a bad day now and again." I tried to nod bravely. "I know. It's just that I want to do well." "Of course you do," Mother agreed. "But crying isn't going to get you anywhere. Come on now, dry your tears." She rose from the bed. That side of the mattress sprang up again, and gathered up my books from the floor. "Here you go. Why don't you spend the next hour studying before you come down to help with dinner?" I sat up and wiped at my cheeks with the back of one hand. "What about the piano?" I asked. "You can let that go for today," Mother replied. "It sounds as though you need some extra time with your books, and that's more important." Had the circumstances been different, I would have been jubilant to be excused from practicing the piano, but that afternoon I felt no joy at all. As it was, I would have gladly practiced an extra half-hour, if only the day had suddenly become like every other. Mother placed the books on my desk and gave them a swift pat. "Come on, the only way to do your lessons well is to buckle down and get to it." I dragged myself from the bed and wearily crossed the room to my desk. "All right, Mama," I said. I sat down and opened a book, not even noticing which one it was. "Call me when you want me to set the table." I followed Mother with my eyes as she left the room, longing to call her back, longing to ask her what I should do, but knowing that if I told her of what was about to happen in Sioux City, she'd tell Papa, and Papa would undoubtedly go down there to the camp, and then... For the next hour I sat unmoving, staring out the window, so lost in thought I didn't even see what was beyond the glass. I was facing the worst dilemma of my life. Should I tell Papa what I knew, or should I remain quiet? There would be consequences either way. If I didn't tell Papa about the upcoming raid, our friends in Sioux City might end up hurt, or worse. At the very least, they would all lose their homes. Most people might not see it as a great loss, the destruction of those makeshift shanties furnished with the scantiest of goods. Nevertheless, it was all those people had. The burning of the camp would leave them with nothing. On the other hand, if I did tell Papa, he might end up hurt, or worse. The thought of anything happening to him was one I couldn't bear. My mind vacillated like a metronome beating time on top of a piano. Back and forth, Papa in Sioux City, Papa in Sioux City. Papa, I told myself, was valuable, was indispensable. His patients needed him, his family needed him, I needed him. I had an obligation to protect him. And yet the people down at Sioux City were no less valuable. Maybe they were poor, maybe they were jobless, but still they were people. I thought about Mrs. Everhart and baby Caroline. I thought about Mr. Lucky and Sherman Brown. I thought about Dick Mason and Alice Hunt and Steele O'Neill and Long John and Shoes. I thought about the 3 musicians and how grand they had sounded when Papa sang Amazing Grace with them. They were all there at the camp, going about their lives, cooking, washing, singing, reading the newspaper, preparing for the evening and the night, completely unaware that this night was not to be like every other. They didn't know, but I knew. I knew there were 3 men among them at this very hour, disguised as transients, who thought them less than human, who considered them vermin. I knew that darkness would bring more men, armed men, angry and unreasonable men, men who had hate in their blood. They would come seeking revenge for the destruction on 3rd Avenue, and it was the innocent residents of Sioux City who would pay. These residents, my friends, were helpless, and there was no one to help them. No one except, perhaps, me. I wanted to save them. I wanted to run to the camp and warn them, to cry out like a modern-day Paul Revere, "The sheriff is coming with his men, get out while you can." But the truth was, I was afraid. I was afraid not only for Papa, but for my own self. I had seen the deputies at work. I had seen men beaten and battered and even shot. I had seen blood on the streets and on the sidewalk, and I believed the sheriff and his men to be so ruthless as to swing their batons or point their pistols at even a young girl if she stood in the way of what they wanted to do. I dismissed all thoughts of going to Sioux City myself. I hadn't the courage. Oh, if only Dick Mason had never come to our door looking for help. If only Papa had never gone to Sioux City that first time. Mother had been right in her presentiments of doom. Something bad was going to happen. It was happening now. My head felt as though it were spinning like the leaves that spiraled downward from the trees in front of the window. There was Papa, and there were the people of Sioux City. I could protect one, or I could give warning to the other, but I couldn't do both. From far away, I heard Mother call me down to chores, but for a moment I could only watch, transfixed, as the occasional leaf broke free from a branch and gave itself over to the wind. For the tree, one small loss, and then another and another, as it slowly succumbed to winter's long sleep. Papa joined us for dinner, something he was rarely able to do. The whole of our immediate family sat around the table that night, my parents, my brother, my 2 sisters. Aunt Sally and her boys would eat when we had finished and made room for them at the table. Dr. Hal, out making a house call, would join them if he got back in time. But for now, it was the 6 of us, gathered around the dinner table the way most families gathered to eat in those days, a regular Norman Rockwell picture. Molly, between bites of food, sang "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" in her childish, high-pitched voice. Mother reminded Molly repeatedly that we don't sing while we're eating, and the rest of us were warned to keep our elbows off the table. Simon, energized by Papa's presence, rambled on about what he'd learned in science class that day, and Papa, listening intently, swatted absently at a fly that buzzed about the kitchen. Each bite of food I swallowed landed like a rock in the pit of my stomach. I finally gave up and resorted to pushing a pea around my plate with the prongs of my fork. "It's just like every other night," I chanted to myself in a desperate bid at make-believe. "Just like every other night, just like every other night." Papa noticed my mood and the fact that the food on my plate was going everywhere but in my mouth. "What's the trouble, Jenny?" he asked. As was Mother's habit, she answered for me. She said she didn't do well on her school lessons today. Papa smiled kindly as he sliced away at the pieces of fried Spam on his plate. "Don't let it bother you," he said. "We all have a bad day once in a while." "That's exactly what I told her," Mother replied with a satisfied nod. Oh, if only it were so simple as all that. I looked up at Papa with pleading eyes, wishing I could throw myself across his lap and tell him everything I knew. More than that, what I really wished, what I wished desperately, was that I knew nothing at all about the raid. I wished that I, too, could go about the evening in blissful ignorance, not knowing what lay ahead. But there was no cure for knowing. I knew, and that was that. "Don't let him go down there tonight," Danny had warned. No, I couldn't. I couldn't let my Papa put himself in danger by going to Sioux City. They'd be all right, I told myself in one last vain attempt to rationalize what I was doing. The Everharts, the Hunts, the Conleys, all of them. They'll have to move on, but thousands of homeless are wandering around the country all the time. Danny said Sheriff Dysinger and the deputies were going to run them out, but that doesn't mean they'll hurt them. No, they'll just scare them off. Then everyone will just move on and find someplace else to live. Maybe they'll even find work if they're forced to go somewhere else. Later that night, when I kissed Papa before going to bed, he gave me a long hug and said, "Good night, Jenny." I couldn't bring myself to wish him a good night in return. In spite of my frail endeavors to minimize and even dismiss the threat to Sioux City, I knew it would not be a good night. It would not be a good night at all. Chapter 25. I couldn't sleep. I tried to pray, but I couldn't do that either. I just kept thinking, dear God, and nothing would come after that. My mind kept drifting down to Sioux City, wandering from shanty to shanty, seeing everyone I had come to know over the summer. I wondered who might be sleeping peacefully, curled up beneath the blankets I'd given them, who might be reading or working by lantern or candlelight, who might be sitting on a doorstep or an upturned cinder block, just looking up at the stars and smoking a cigarette. Was little Caroline asleep in her crate, or just now being sung to sleep in her mother's arms? Was Mr. Lucky stretched out on the dirt floor of his slightly charred shack, his head resting on T-Bone's furry rib cage as on a pillow? Were Joe and Oscar and Bob sitting beside a late-night campfire, swapping stories about the past, dreaming aloud about the future? Was Layla lying awake among the tangled limbs of her 3 younger siblings, wondering when her interrupted life would begin again? They were all there in the little ramshackle city by the river, with only their usual fears to haunt them in the dark. Where will my food come from tomorrow? Will I find work? Will I ever see my family again? These fears had become familiar, acceptable, like an arthritic knee one has learned to live with. They lay there in their safe assumption, it's just like every other night. Tonight is just like every other night. And for all they knew, it was. But I knew otherwise. I wondered when their night would be broken in two, shattered by the sheriff and his men. Was it now? Was this the hour the lawmen were descending upon the camp and forcing out the residents like cattle from a pen? Mother came upstairs to bed at 10:30. Papa followed at 11 o'clock. The house was dark and quiet, except for the usual night sounds outside, the katydids, the occasional passing car. I listened to myself breathe. I felt my heart beating in my chest. I didn't know what a man felt like as he waited for his executioners to come, but I thought it must be something like this. Dear God, please, God. Fear hovered over me thick as fog, weighing down on me until I felt myself choking. Still the minutes dragged on. Papa slept. Mother slept. Everyone slept. I sat up in bed trying to catch my breath, then pushed back the covers and crawled out. The room was chilly, filled with the brisk air of an October night, and I instinctively reached for the robe that lay across the foot of my bed to throw it on over my cotton gown. But I stopped myself and left the robe where it lay. Stepping to the window, I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. I stood there unmoving, the soles of my bare feet planted on the raw boards of the hardwood floor. The wind seeped in through the cracks of the window frame and made me shiver, but I didn't wrap my arms about myself for warmth. I wanted to be cold, to suffer, if even only just a little bit, to pay penance for what I had done by not doing anything. Outside, the night shadows played upon the grass. The moon was just a fragment of a shining planet in the sky. I looked up at the stars sprinkled like glitter across black paper and heard Molly's tiny, sweet voice. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. The universe was so vast, so expansive, and the world and Sioux City and I, so small. Oh God, dear God. For a long while I watched and waited. I strained to hear any unusual sounds, any cry in the dark, any indication that what had been forewarned had come to pass. And then, finally, there it was, the sound of rushing footfalls on the sidewalk, one pair of feet pounding the pavement in front of our house. The footsteps gave way to a panicked rapping on the front door, and an unfamiliar voice calling out, "Doc Ada! Doc Ada!" The light went on in my parents' room, casting a subdued glow into the hall. In the next moment, Papa, his clothes already thrown on over his pajamas, rushed past the open door of my room. The knocking went on and on. I almost thought I could feel the house trembling under the attack. "Coming!" Papa called as he hurried down the stairs. I followed, my bare feet slapping against the floor, but paused at the top of the staircase. Mother, in her robe and slippers, shuffled up behind me and, stifling a yawn, said, "Go back to bed, Virginia. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with." She thought it was just another call for the doctor, an anxious father-to-be or the son of a man taken sick. She thought it was just someone come to ask the doctor to rush to another bedside. But she was wrong. Papa opened the door and an ill-clad youth came tumbling in, clutching his cap. I didn't recognize him, but I knew he had to be from the camp. Of course he would be the one elected to come. He was young and long-legged and able to run quickly. He stood there in the hallway, panting and gasping for breath. "Andy," Papa said in surprise. "The camp's burning," the young man cried. "Some people's been hurt. You gotta come." The commotion had awakened both Aunt Sally, who was sleeping in Papa's study, and Dr. Hal, who slept on a rollaway in the back room of the office. They entered the hall from either side, like two actors making an entrance from opposite wings. Dr. Hal, like Papa, was already dressed. "What's going on, Will?" Dr. Hal asked. "I'm not sure." To Andy, Papa said, "Now calm down and catch your breath. What's this all about?" The young man's shoulders still heaved. He squeezed his cap more tightly in his hands, making of it one narrow bit of cloth. "Some men came. They started driving everyone out and set fire to the camp." "Harold, get my bag, quickly," Papa instructed. "I'll go with you, Will." "No, better if you—" "I can help, Will." The two doctors looked at each other for one brief moment. "All right, then," Papa conceded. "Get both our bags. Let's go. Andy will take the car." Danny's words came to me then, screaming in their intensity. "Don't let your papa go down there tonight." I flew down the stairs, stumbling and clutching at the banister, crying out, "No, Papa, no, you can't go, you can't." Mother behind me called out my name, but I kept on without turning around. My father looked at me, puzzled. I rushed to him and threw my arms around his waist, as if to physically restrain him. "No, Papa, you can't go down there." "Jenny," Papa said quietly, shaking his head, "what's come over you?" "It's Sheriff Dysinger, Papa. It's the sheriff and his men. You can't go down there. They'll kill you if you do." Papa unlocked my arms from around his middle and, holding me by the wrists, took one step backward. "What do you know about this, Jenny?" Tears burned my eyes and coursed down my cheeks, and Papa's face became a blur. "Danny told me. Sheriff Dysinger's son. He said there wasn't any way to stop—" Papa shook me, one brief shake of anger. "When did you learn about this?" "This afternoon. He told me, on the way home from school." "Why didn't you tell me, Jenny?" Papa's cheeks flared red. I'd never seen him so angry, had rarely ever seen him angry at all, and it frightened me into silence. When I didn't answer, he repeated sternly, "Jenny, why didn't you tell me?" Papa and Dr. Hal and Mother and Aunt Sally and the boy from the camp all stood there waiting for my reply, but I couldn't speak. I heard the words in my mind but couldn't bring them to my tongue. "I wanted to protect you, Papa. I stayed quiet for your sake." I stood mute as a statue, my mouth open dumbly, staring up at my father. He let go of my wrists, almost thrust me aside, and took his medical bag from Dr. Hal. Without another word, the three men moved quickly through the hall toward the back door. Mother, Aunt Sally, and I stood immobile on the cold hardwood floor and watched them go. We heard the slamming of the door, followed a minute later by the starting of the car engine, and finally the crunching of tires over gravel in the alley. Then everything became so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the piano, the clock that measured off all the desperate hours of our lives. I lifted my eyes slowly to Mother's, afraid of what she might say. But instead of reprimanding me, she held out her arms and invited me in. "Why, you're as cold as ice, Virginia," she whispered. With the belt of her quilted robe, she wiped away the tears on my cheeks. It was past midnight, but Mother decided she and I ought to get dressed, just in case. She insisted I put on a wool dress and sweater, thick socks and shoes, and though I balked, I did it. Mother and Aunt Sally, who stayed in her gown and robe, sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and talking in low tones. The boys had woken up briefly, but were sent back to bed after receiving an evasive explanation as to what the commotion was all about. I paced the front hall, periodically checked the clock on the piano, went to the back door to watch for car headlights in the alley, then went back to the front hall. "Quit pacing," Aunt Sally pleaded during one of my trips through the kitchen. "You're making me all the more nervous." I retreated to the front door and looked out at the street. I stood unmoving for several minutes in the hopes of appeasing Aunt Sally. Then I continued pacing, my footsteps echoing loudly through the otherwise quiet house. At 2 o'clock I paused in the kitchen doorway and asked, "Should I have told him, Mama?" Mother only sighed, looked at me sadly, then got up to pour herself and Aunt Sally more coffee. I went back to the clock on the piano. 2 minutes after 2. "He'll be all right," Mother assured me on my next trip to the back door. "Do you really think so, Mama?" I asked, my forehead pressed up against the glass in the door. "Yes," she said. But from the sound of her voice and the fact that she wanted us dressed, just in case, I knew she didn't think so at all. I walked the length of the hall again and looked out the front door. Then I went into the parlor to look at the clock. I thought about wandering into Papa's study, but I wasn't sure I could bring myself to do it. While I stood by the piano debating, the voices of the women in the kitchen drifted to me, and I caught snatches of their conversation. "I had a feeling all along," Mother was saying, "that no good would come of this. I tried to tell him." "Nothing you could say or do to persuade him," Aunt Sally responded. "Once Will makes up his mind, that's it. See that his responsibility was here, with his family and his practice. Know him well enough to know he had his reasons. He thought it was important, thought he could help." I sauntered back to the kitchen and settled myself in a chair at the table. Both my mother and aunt looked across at me in silence, unwilling to continue the conversation I had interrupted. I wanted to tell them what Papa had told me about why he spent time in Sioux City, but before I could say anything, Aunt Sally spoke again. "Every time I think it's all over," she muttered, "something else happens." For a moment the three of us were quiet. I listened to the clinking of the spoon against the porcelain cup as my aunt stirred sugar into her coffee. Then she continued, "It kind of makes you wonder where God is in all of this, doesn't it? I wanted to believe he was there with us, and also at the camp with Papa, and everywhere anyone needed him that night. But all I could picture was a distant throne somewhere beyond the stars. Dear God, I thought, please, God, look down from heaven." A sudden furious rapping at the front door interrupted my prayer. Mother stood and rushed down the hall, with Aunt Sally and me right behind her. She opened the door to find the same young man who had stood there 2 hours earlier. His face was streaked black with soot, and this time I smelled the smoke on his clothes. His hands, now empty of the cap, flailed wildly. "Mrs. Ada, the doc's been hurt bad. The other doctor, the young guy, took him to the hospital in Doc Ada's car. He told me to ask you if you can get to the hospital right away." Without a word to the winded messenger, Mother turned to me. "Run next door and ask Mr. Mobley to drive us," she said evenly, as though she'd been expecting the news all along. Mechanically, I did as I was told. I was so overwhelmed by feelings that I couldn't feel anything anymore. Chapter 26. Dr. Hal was waiting for us just beyond the double-glass doors of the hospital lobby. With numerous expressions of thanks for giving us a ride at such an hour of the night, we sent Mr. Mobley back home to bed. He offered to stay with us in spite of his sleepwear. When he'd learned that Papa was hurt, he grabbed his car keys and flew from the house in his robe and slippers. But Mother assured him we'd be fine. Before he left, he lightly touched the top of my head with his big paw of a hand and said he'd not be sleeping but praying. Mother thanked him again, and I hoped that our neighbor would be better at persuading God down from his throne than I had been. Dr. Hal led us to an empty waiting room, where, with an abrupt flash of his palm, he indicated that Mother and I should sit. We lowered ourselves onto a couch. Both of us balanced on the edge as we leaned toward Dr. Hal, who settled himself in a chair across from us. It was only then that I noticed one sleeve of Dr. Hal's shirt was missing, torn from the shoulder. His clothes were filthy, smudged with dirt and ash, and like the messenger, he smelled of smoke. His face, too, was dark with soot, and on either side, from temple to jawline, a streak of sweat sliced through the black like a river. What was most unnerving, though, were the splotches of blood that dotted his clothes, as if someone had flicked a huge paintbrush at him. Brownish dots, like rust, lay splattered on the white of his shirt, on the tan of his pants. On his right thigh were 4 long stripes where he had obviously wiped his fingers. He was a macabre portrait of modern art, the creation of a fatalistic artist whose desire was to capture death on canvas. "How is he, Harold?" Mother asked, her voice trembling with the anxiety she was no longer able to hide. Dr. Hal pressed his hands together between his knees. "It's impossible to say at this point," he began, sounding less like a relative than a doctor. "He's in surgery right now to remove a bullet from his leg. It shattered his femur, that is, his thigh bone." A shattered thigh bone. That didn't sound so bad to me. Lots of people had been shot in the leg or the arm or even the shoulder and had recovered just fine. Now, a chest wound, that was a different story altogether. If a person was shot in the chest, everyone had a right to start worrying. But a leg? Pshaw, that would heal easily enough. Papa might be left with a limp, but all the cowboys and the gangsters in the movies that were shot in the leg. Mother interrupted my mental stream of solace by asking Dr. Hal, "Did he lose a lot of blood?" Her eyes traveled over Dr. Hal's clothes as she asked the question. "Yes," Dr. Hal replied. "Evidently, the femoral artery or the vein, or perhaps both, were involved. But even that isn't our greatest concern at the moment." He paused and took a deep breath. He wasn't quite able to keep eye contact with Mother. "He's sustained a head injury, the full extent of which can't be determined right away." "A head injury?" Mother echoed, sounding incredulous, not quite believing Papa had suffered such a wound. "Did he strike his head when he fell after he was shot?" Dr. Hal shook his head. "No, Lillian. I wasn't with him when he was hurt, so I didn't see what happened. Will and I had gone off in different directions once we reached the camp to try to help whomever we could. By the time we got there, more than half the camp was burning. It was absolute chaos, people running, screaming." "But what of William?" she interrupted. "What exactly happened to him?" Mother shut her eyes momentarily, as though to keep her patience from escaping. Dr. Hal sighed. He rubbed his thighs with his open hands like a public speaker with sweaty palms. "There are indications Will was beaten with a blunt object. A stick of wood, maybe. Or a billy club. Or it could have been the butt of a gun. It's hard to say for sure, but apparently he was beaten after he was already down." Mother gasped and lifted one trembling hand to her lips. Who could have done such a thing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Dr. Hal responded morosely. For a moment he seemed like a relative again rather than a doctor. He looked at me as he confirmed my words to Papa some hours earlier. "We do know it was the sheriff and his deputies who pulled off the raid, just like Jenny said. But as to who actually did this to Will, I simply don't know." "Just how bad is he, Harold?" "Again, I can only confess that I don't know. When I reached him, he was still conscious, but just barely. Fortunately, in the midst of all that chaos, I was able to hear the cries of the man who came across Will just as his assailant ran off. The man just kept screaming for help, saying Dr. Ada was down." Dr. Hal paused and shook his head. He took a deep breath before continuing. "So the good thing is that I got to Will right away. I tied a tourniquet around his thigh with my shirt sleeve to staunch the bleeding, but it was obvious that wasn't the only thing I was dealing with. Will had been beaten pretty badly. He's bruised all over, and there's a possibility that his right arm is broken. X-rays will clarify that. Anyway, the man who alerted me to Will was somehow able to hunt down a blanket. At the mention of the blanket, He glanced at me to acknowledge my unwitting contribution to Papa's rescue, in one of the shanties that was still standing, and we used that as a kind of hammock to carry Will to the car. I hated to move him like that, considering the condition he was in. No telling the damage. He stopped abruptly and stared at his hands. Suddenly he looked very young, almost like a child who'd been caught disobeying and was bracing to accept his punishment. When he didn't continue, Mother assured him, "You did the right thing, Harold. There wasn't anything else you could do." Dr. Hal nodded and exhaled so heavily I thought every last bit of oxygen must have been drained from his body. "As I say, our greatest concern is the head wound. There appears to have been just one blow to the head, but it was a hard one, right about here, running along the right side of his scalp." Dr. Hal ran his fingertips through his disheveled hair to indicate the spot. "Will hasn't been through the X-ray department yet. They wanted to get him into surgery for the bullet wound as quickly as possible. But they did take a few pictures with a portable machine, the quality of which isn't as good as what you can get with the real thing, but good enough to reveal that there is a fracture of the skull. It appears at this point not to be depressed, that his bone didn't collapse into the brain, which of course is a good thing. What happens to the skull itself doesn't matter very much. Like any other bone, the skull can be expected to heal pretty easily, barring infection. What matters is the damage to the brain, and that's what's in question at this point." Mother and I were silent for a moment, unable to take in what Dr. Hal was trying to tell us. Finally, tentatively, Mother asked, "Well, when will we know something, Harold?" "With an injury like this," Dr. Hal explained, "it's impossible to know anything right away. Diagnosing head trauma is always a matter of observation, a matter of time." Mother moistened her lips with her tongue. She was breathing faster than I thought she should. "You say he's in surgery now?" "Yes." "What about the anesthesia? What will that do?" "They'll use a local. It won't have any effect on his brain." "Oh, yes. Yes, of course, I should have realized." Mother squeezed her hands together and pursed her lips. "The man who alerted you to Will, did he see who did this?" Dr. Hal's eyes hung heavy with regret. "I'm afraid not, Lillian. It was dark. The man, the assailant, was running away. I didn't even know the name of the man who called me over to Will. I wished I'd asked for it now, but there was so much confusion I couldn't think. Anyway, I asked him if he saw who did this, if he had any idea at all, and he said he didn't." The thought of Papa lying helpless while one of Sheriff Dysinger's deputies, or maybe the sheriff himself, beat him until he was bruised and broken, the image was more than I could bear. From the moment the young messenger came to our door until now, I had moved in a daze, but talk of Papa being battered by the faceless assailant reignited my emotions. They sizzled to life like a flame crawling along a fuse, then exploded into rage. I buried my face in my hands and wept, falling forward into my own lap. Mother's arm curled around my back as she drew me to her. I leaned my head against her chest, my anger and grief spilling out and leaving moist, salty spots on Mother's plain cotton blouse. How long she allowed me to cry, I can't say. I lost all track of time. "There, Jenny, hush now," she said repeatedly, stroking my hair. "It'll be all right." To Dr. Hal she remarked, "I shouldn't have brought her with me. It's too much. She's too young." "Why don't I drive her home?" "I'm not too young," I objected, pulling away from Mother and sitting bolt upright. Wiping my wet cheeks with my palms and sniffing loudly, I said, "I want to stay here where Papa is. Please, Mama, please let me stay." Mother's mouth was a thin line. Her shoulders sagged. "It's against my better judgment, but all right, you can stay. Go find a rest room and wash your face while I call Sally and let her know what's going on." I did as I was told, then returned to the waiting room. The thought occurred to me that we'd spent much of the past several months just waiting for one thing or another, waiting around the radio, waiting for news of the strike, waiting for word about Uncle Jim, and now waiting to see what would happen to Papa. We were living out our days in one huge waiting room. "Did you call Aunt Sally, Mama?" I asked. "Yes." "Was she awake?" "Of course. She was sitting right there by the phone." "What did she say?" "That she'd be praying." What's she going to tell Simon and Claudia and Molly when they wake up? She'll tell them that your father is going to be in the hospital for a little while, but that they mustn't worry. I hope Molly doesn't cry. And Sally will know what to do if she does. Mama? Yes, Virginia? I can't help but to be worried, even if it's a sin and I'm not trusting God. Mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, It's not a sin to be worried, Virginia. We can't help worrying sometimes, but in spite of what we feel, we can still trust God to do what's right. After that, we didn't talk much. Dr. Hal got himself a cup of coffee. Mother declined his offer, saying she couldn't possibly drink any more coffee that night, and paced the room as he drank. Sometimes he stopped at the window and stared out at the night sky, just as I had done earlier in my room at home. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Oh God, dear God, up above the world so high, please look down and see us. Mother pulled a small Bible from her purse and read to herself. The trembling fingers with which she turned the pages were the only evidence of the turmoil in her heart. I lay on the couch, my head on her lap, and drifted in and out of sleep. When I slept, I had wild, disjointed dreams in which I was clubbing a defenseless Sheriff Dysinger with a baseball bat. And when I awoke, I was sorry that my hands were empty and that the sheriff was no doubt by now sleeping soundly in his warm bed at home. Papa was on the operating table until almost dawn. When he was finally taken to the intensive care unit for post-operative observation, the surgeon came and spoke with Mother, Dr. Hal, and me. We heard his footsteps in the corridor before we saw him. When he appeared in the doorway, a wave of nausea rippled through my stomach. Here he was, the man who had come to tell us about Papa, the messenger of Papa's fate. While we waited, at least we had a cushion of time in which we could dream and pray and hope for the best. But now that time was up, and there could be no more hopeful conjecture. The doctor was here, and like it or not, we had no choice but to listen to what he had to say, to hear the truth about Papa's condition. I thought fleetingly of the messengers in ancient Greece who were executed for bringing bad news. Though I had always considered it unfair that they should die for simply doing their job, I suddenly understood the desire to have the bearer of bad tidings snuffed out so he couldn't come around again. Dr. Hal walked across the waiting room with his right hand extended to greet the surgeon. He introduced Mother and me. The surgeon shook Mother's hand and offered a polite but formal greeting. He was a man by the name of Dr. Rawls, whom neither Mother nor I had ever met before, though we were acquainted with many doctors through Papa's practice. A heavy-set, middle-aged, weary-looking man, he was still dressed up in his surgical garb, his mask still tied about his thick neck and dangling beneath his chin like a discarded feed bag. His hair was hidden completely by his white cap, the rim of which was darkened with sweat. His ample gown had a bib of sweat across the front and, worse, splatters of blood. Papa's blood. First there was a little bit of Papa on Dr. Hal, I thought, and now there's a little bit of Papa on this doctor, too. It was strange and disconcerting to see my father's life-blood where it didn't belong. It had flowed through Papa's veins, and it ought still to be traveling that old familiar route, not adorning the clothing of these two men. Mother and I had stood to greet the doctor, but he invited us to sit again. When the four of us were seated, Dr. Rawls began speaking in low tones. He assured us that the surgery on Papa's leg had gone reasonably well, but as Dr. Hal had already pointed out, the head injury was an even greater cause for concern. "The first 24 hours will be critical," Dr. Rawls explained. "Of those patients who die of brain injury, more than half die within the first 24 hours. We've already called for a neurologist to conduct a full examination tomorrow, later this morning. The results of his exam will give us a better idea as to what we're dealing with here. Of course, it's after 24 to 36 hours that we may begin to see symptoms of delayed or secondary increased intracranial pressure." As he talked, I noticed Mother's jaw working, as though she were trying to chew on the doctor's words to make them easier to swallow. "If there is swelling, it could be the result of hemorrhage, or edema, or perhaps both. No doubt the neurologist will want to perform a lumbar puncture as soon as Dr. Ada has stabilized to determine whether there is blood in his cerebrospinal fluid. I didn't know what the doctor was talking about, and furthermore, for reasons I couldn't quite pinpoint right at the moment, I didn't like him very much. I only wanted to get away from him and his statistics and his medical mumbo-jumbo as quickly as possible. Mother must have felt the same way, because she interrupted the man by asking, "May I see my husband now, Dr. Rawls?" The doctor denied Mother's request with a shake of his head. "Better if you didn't," he replied stiffly, "not while he remains in intensive care. Go home and rest first, and when you return you can see him. In the meantime, we'll call you if there is any significant change in his condition." Mother, stunned by the doctor's refusal, started to protest, but Dr. Hal stopped her by patting her shoulder. "Dr. Rawls is right, Lillian," he said. "Come on, I'll take you home. After Will's had a chance to recover a bit from the surgery, we'll come back and see him." Mother's mouth closed up like a nutcracker's jaw snapping on a hinge. She stared at Dr. Rawls with steely eyes, a gaze I had learned to fear early in life. But to my surprise, she didn't argue. Without saying anything at all, without even the pretense of propriety or a single word of farewell, she turned to go. But Dr. Rawls stopped her with one more statistic. "Do keep in mind, Mrs. Ada," he said, "that 70% of head injury cases are treated successfully, and a full recovery is made." He smiled wanly, offering us one small hint of his humanity. But neither Mother nor I received affably his attempt at encouragement. In spite of the fact that the doctor's statistics were in our favor, all I could think about was the 30% who weren't so lucky. As we walked out of the waiting room and down the long white corridor of the hospital, I held onto Mother's hand and felt, in spite of my earlier protests, like a child again. In fact, wished indeed that I were, holding her hand as we walked to the park, or to church, or to the store as we once had done. We arrived home a weary lot that morning. Dr. Hal, in spite of his lack of sleep, opened the office and saw patients. Mother let me stay home from school to rest. She put on her apron to prepare breakfast, but Aunt Sally shooed her off to bed, saying she could take care of everything until Mother awakened. When I crawled into bed, the morning sun was just beginning to peek in through the east window of my room, like a candle tentatively taking the flame. I lay awake and watched, knowing I wouldn't see the angels if they came, but hoping they were climbing down the sun's ladder anyway, to come and help us. Chapter 27. It was dark when Mother slipped into my room and seated herself on the edge of the bed. I was only vaguely aware of her presence at first, frowning, I think, as I felt the bed shift to one side under her weight, unhappy at the intrusion into my sleep. The higher toward wakefulness I climbed, the more confused I became. What was happening? Why was Mother slipping into my room like this in the middle of the night? I felt her hand on my arm. "Jenny, time to wake up now." Time to wake up for what? For school? I had always awakened on my own. I didn't need Mother to wake me. Had I been sick? What day was this? What was going on? And then I remembered. "Mama," I cried, fully awake. "What time is it?" "About 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock at night?" "That's right." "Have I slept all day? More than 12 hours? "Yes, and no wonder." I threw back the covers. "I have to get up and see Papa." How, I wondered, could I have slept so deeply and for so long, while Papa lay suspended somewhere between life and death in the hospital? Mother tightened her grasp on my arm. "I was just at the hospital," she said. "What?" I couldn't believe she would go without me. "Why didn't you come get me? Why didn't you let me go with you?" Her face was little more than a shadow in the dark room, and I couldn't see her expression. I reached over and turned on the lamp beside the bed. Mother's face appeared strained and wan, but otherwise she was calm. "Your father's still in intensive care," she said quietly, "and you wouldn't have been allowed in with me." "You saw Papa?" I asked. Mother nodded. "How was he, Mama? How did he look?" "Well, not quite like himself." Mother tried to smile, but her effort didn't amount to much. "Did you talk with the doctor?" I was anxious to know everything, though Mother seemed reluctant to tell. "Did you talk with that neurologist they were going to call in?" "Yes, I saw him. His name is Dr. Murphy. He seems like a nice sort of fellow. More personable than Dr. Rawls, anyway." "But what did he say?" Mother lifted her shoulders and let them fall again. "That we can't know anything for certain yet." "But Dr. Rawls told us that much," I sputtered. "I thought a specialist was supposed to know more than a regular doctor. What was the use of calling him in if he can't tell us more than that?" I was beginning to feel irritated by the entire medical profession. Like Harold said, it takes time to assess the damage of head trauma. "Couldn't Dr. Murphy tell you anything?" "He said that your father has some reflex movement and that his pupils respond to light. Those are good things," he said. I was almost afraid to ask, but I forced myself to form the words. "What are the bad things, then?" Mother thought a moment, her mouth turning downward in a visible frown, as if she were mentally sifting through the vast clutter of information the neurologist had dumped at her feet. "Your father's age, for one thing." "Papa's not old," I cried. "Of course not, but I guess most people over 45 don't recover as well from head injuries." More statistics. I clenched my teeth. "He doesn't know Papa," I said. "He doesn't know that Papa's different." I let my words trail off as Mother patted my hand. All she said was, "Well," and I knew what she meant. I lowered my eyes to the quilt that covered my bed and tried to anchor myself by following the pattern in the stitches that connected the squares. After a moment I asked, "What else did the doctor say?" "He said a lot of things, Virginia, most of which neither you nor I can fully understand. I'm finally learning that for a doctor's wife I'm woefully ignorant when it comes to medicine and the human body." She attempted to smile again. "I know about childhood diseases, but that's about it. Though that's debatable, too, since I didn't recognize chickenpox in the girls when all the symptoms were laid out right under my nose." Mother spoke wistfully. Personally, I didn't blame her for not knowing what she had never learned, but she seemed keenly disappointed in herself. Nevertheless, it wasn't Mother I was concerned about at the moment. "Mama," I ventured timidly, "did the doctor tell you whether or not Papa would be all right?" "No, Virginia," Mother replied quietly. "He didn't tell me that. He can't answer that question, I'm afraid." "No," I said. "I didn't think he could." Suddenly Mother stood. "Time for you to eat something," she said. "Everyone else has had supper already." "But when can I see Papa?" "Possibly tomorrow. I don't know for sure." "You won't go back to the hospital without me, will you?" "I don't like the thought of keeping you from school, but no, I won't go to the hospital without you. Your father needs you more than you need to be in school. We'll arrange for your lessons to be dropped off at the hospital for a couple of days. Come on now, let's get you fed." I got up then, and sitting alone in my bathrobe and slippers at the kitchen table, tried to eat the scrambled eggs and toast Mother made for me before she disappeared to put the girls to bed. Though I hadn't eaten all day, I wasn't particularly hungry. I chewed slowly, thinking about what a strange place the kitchen was when there was nobody in it. Kind of like a church sanctuary without a congregation. The room was meant to be occupied, was built for bustle and activity, was where life was supposed to be going on. But now it was quiet and empty. Even the electric fan was still, turned off and unplugged after having worked so hard for so many months. The dishes had been washed and put into place behind the glass door cabinets, the plates and bowls in stacks, the teacups dangling from little hooks, appearing unused. Even the refrigerator, tired of humming, was silent. Quiet as a tomb, I thought. The whole room was so quiet that even the scraping of my fork against the plate and the crunching of toast between my jaws was an annoying and grating noise. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten in the kitchen alone. I couldn't remember ever eating in the kitchen alone. And the fact that I was there by myself, eating scrambled eggs in my pajamas at 8:30 at night, meant that everything in my life had changed. I looked about the room nervously, fearing that at any moment the door to the pantry, or the door to the basement, or the door to the backyard would fly open, and something evil would pounce in upon me. But what came into the kitchen a moment later was my brother Simon, and when I saw him I sighed openly with relief. Simon was here, and a little bit of life was just the same as it had always been. Maybe he'd sit down and we could talk a while, give each other a boost of encouragement. We'd experienced the riot together, and had come away closer to each other for it. Now we could face together what had happened to Papa. Even though he was just a little boy, he had a certain strength about him, and heaven knew I needed that strength now. But my hopes quickly toppled into little crumbs of dread when Simon acknowledged me with one long stare of contempt and said nothing. I knew what he was thinking. Papa had gone to the camp and had the life nearly beaten out of him, and Simon blamed me. I watched him reach for a glass from the cupboard and fill it with milk from the bottle in the refrigerator. A pain hung in my chest as heavy as lead and pulled my shoulders down. I didn't want Papa to go down there, Simon. I defended myself quietly. You knew about the raid, he accused, turning from the refrigerator so quickly that some of the milk in his glass splashed out onto his hand. You should have stopped him. I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't. You don't understand. If Papa dies, it'll be your fault. His words hit me like a club across my sagging shoulders and knocked the breath out of me. He's not going to die, I wanted to yell, but the words caught in my throat. Simon's angry face became a blur as my eyes clouded with tears. I ran up to my room and cried myself to sleep, but even then I slept only fitfully between each fresh onslaught of tears. The next morning, I awoke abruptly at dawn and realized that at just about that same time the day before, Dr. Rawls had come to meet us in the waiting room at the hospital. The first 24 hours will be critical, he had said, and this was it, the 0 hour. The first 24 had passed, and as far as I knew, Papa was still alive. Throwing back the covers, I climbed out of bed and bundled up in my bathrobe and slippers against the morning chill. I might have enjoyed the cool weather after the unbearable heat of summer, but at the moment I gave it little more than a passing thought. I had to find out about Papa. As though in answer to my unspoken question, the telephone rang just as I entered the upstairs hall. I rushed down the stairs, hanging precariously onto the banister, while Mother, already up and dressed, moved quickly from the kitchen to pick up the extension on the table near the front door. I arrived breathless and anxious at her elbow. She only glanced at me, then turned away so I wouldn't distract her. "I see," she said. "All right. Yes, I see. Yes." Light-headed with fear, I wanted to beat on Mother's broad back to get her attention, to get her to turn toward me so I could read her face. What was the person saying? Was Papa all right? Had he taken a turn for the worse? Mother's voice, calm and even, gave not a clue. "Yes, we'll be there as soon as we can," she concluded. "Thank you." She slowly returned the receiver to the cradle, seeming to barely possess the strength to carry out the task. She finally turned her eyes to me. I met her gaze. She didn't smile. "Eat some breakfast and dress quickly, Virginia," she instructed. "Your father's out of the intensive care unit, and the doctor says we can see him." "Is he awake?" "No, not yet." "But is he better?" "Enough to be moved from intensive care." "When will he wake up?" "Don't ask me questions I can't answer, Virginia. Run upstairs and get yourself ready to go." A half-hour later, while Mother put on her hat and Dr. Hal warmed up the car to drop us off at the hospital, I ran into Simon in the hall. He was just coming down to breakfast. Aunt Sally was frying eggs in the kitchen, and he was carrying a pile of school books under his arm. He walked by me without saying a word, as if I wasn't there. His accusations of the previous night came thumping down on me again, and I bit my lower lip to keep from crying. But to my surprise, Simon stopped short of the kitchen doorway and turned to look at me. "Ma tells me you're going to the hospital to see Pa," he said. "Yes, he's out of intensive care. The hospital called." He was trying to look angry, but without much success. Simon was never able to be anything other than genuine. I knew from the look on his face he was sorry for what he'd said, though he'd never go so far as to admit it. Instead, he requested, "Tell Papa hello for me, will ya?" "Sure, Simon, I'll tell him. Tell him I wish I could come myself." "All right. But I can't, seeing as how the hospital rules says I'm not old enough." "I'm sure he knows about the rules." Hoisting the books up higher under his arm, he turned toward the kitchen again. But he paused and said over his shoulder, "Tell him I'm expecting him home by my birthday. That gives him a whole 2 weeks and 3 days to get better. I think that's enough time." I couldn't respond in words, my throat was so choked up. But I nodded and gave my brother a half smile, and he went off to get a plate of Aunt Sally's eggs. Papa had been moved into a private room on the wing of the hospital that was named after my grandfather. It was a first-floor room, overlooking the hospital grounds, where patients' families strolled to calm their nerves, and patients themselves were wheeled to sit in the sun on warm days or in the shade of one of the maple trees. As we walked from the lobby to Papa's room, I noticed that Mother and I were the only civilians on the floor, that is, the only ones not dressed in the white uniform of the Army of Healers. We were the oddities because it was still only mid-morning, and visiting hours, noon to 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, hadn't begun. The rules were being bent for us, not only because we were the family of Dr. Ada, but because Mother was the daughter of Theodore Foster. Our double-edged status of privilege allowed us free access to Papa now that he was out of intensive care. Mother lectured me through the length of the corridor on how I ought to behave. "You must be brave, Virginia. There's to be no crying while we're with your father. I don't want to upset him." Because Papa hadn't yet awakened, I didn't think he'd know whether I cried or not. But Mother seemed convinced otherwise, and for that reason, just in case she was right, I promised myself I wouldn't cry. We finally reached the door of Papa's room, and while I paused on the threshold to gather my courage, Mother marched right in, leaned over the figure of Papa on the bed, and kissed the corner of his mouth. She didn't have to bend over very far, because the head of the bed was elevated to a nearly 45-degree angle. A small ice pack crowned the top of Papa's head, and I thought he could have looked rather comic, like one of the Laurel and Hardy duo complaining of flu, if the situation hadn't been so grave. Mother pressed her fingers lightly to one of his cheeks and said, "We're here, William. Virginia and I have come to be with you." She went on talking to him softly while I made my way to the bed, the tapping of the heels of my shoes against the bare floor an annoying din in the quiet building. When I reached the bed, I followed Mother's lead and kissed Papa's cheek. The bristle of his whiskers against my lips startled me. I had never known Papa's face to be anything other than smooth and fragrant with aftershave. I drew back suddenly, thinking, this isn't Papa. And indeed, the man in the bed bore little resemblance to the father I knew. Beneath the sandy whiskers, his usually ruddy cheeks were a pasty gray. His face looked small, his closed eyes naked and impish without his glasses. Both eyes were cradled by black and blue crescents, like 2 soft-boiled eggs served in egg cups. His nostrils and the inside of his ears were painted red with iodine. I didn't know why then, but I would shortly learn that meningitis poses a serious danger to head injury cases, and that this particular precaution was taken so that the germ-carrying microbes wouldn't enter Papa's head via these passages. A large bandage circled his head, so that between the bandage and the ice pack only a tuft or 2 of hair stuck out on top of his scalp, like grass springing up between the cracks of a sidewalk. Even his ample body appeared smaller somehow, lying there beneath the crisp hospital linens. Since the sheet was pulled all the way up to his chin, his broken arm and shattered leg were tucked away, and I guess in a way I was rather glad that I couldn't see the whole mess at once. Aunt Sally had always said that things happened in threes, but this time she was wrong. Papa was the 4th in our family to receive a head wound in this war called the Depression, and his injury was the most serious of all. "Don't just stand there gaping, Virginia," Mother chided. "Say hello to your father." When I cast a dubious glance at Mother, she drew me aside. In a whisper she said, "We don't know how much he can hear, but maybe if we talk to him as though everything were normal, it'll help to bring him around." Everything was not normal. Everything was very far from normal. I had promised not to cry, and that was hard enough, but to talk as though nothing were wrong, that was a whole different story. It seemed too much for Mother to ask of me, but wanting not to disappoint her, I said, "I'll try, Mama." When we returned to Papa's side, though, and I opened my mouth to speak, nothing came out. I was paralyzed by the strangeness of talking to a sleeping figure. It seemed like talking to a photograph, or to the tombstone of someone who obviously wasn't around to listen anymore. I glanced up again at Mother. She nodded at me to go on, like a mother bird nudging the baby out of the nest with her beak. Drawing in a deep breath, I told myself I couldn't exhale without including words with the air. I gathered together a few words in my chest, pushed them up to my tongue, and said, "Hello, Papa. It's me. I almost said Virginia, but somehow using my full given name didn't seem right. To Papa, I was Jenny. I had tried so hard to get him to call me Virginia, yet now I wondered why. What I wouldn't have given at that moment to hear him call me Jenny again. "Papa, it's Jenny," I said finally. "Mama and I are here. We're fine. Everyone's fine. Simon says hello. He and Claudia and Molly miss you. They wanted to come, but you know they're not old enough. I'm glad I could come, Papa. The hospital is breaking the rules for us, you know, because you're special. Mom and I can come whenever we want and stay as long as we want, so we'll try to be here as much as we can if Mama doesn't make me go back to school too soon." The longer I spoke, the more easily the words came, but just as I began to feel comfortable talking with someone who couldn't hear, Dr. Rawls arrived and interrupted us, lumbering into the room like a polar bear up on his hind legs. He tossed a greeting to Mother, but seemed not to notice me. After studying Papa's chart and hanging it back on the foot of the bed, he said, "Well, we performed the first lumbar puncture early this morning and discovered very little blood in the spinal fluid, which is a good sign. Of course, we'd like the fluid to be clear, but there wasn't enough blood to cause undue concern at this point. According to the manometer reading, there's a moderate increase in intracranial pressure, but again, there's no real cause for alarm as yet. We'll keep an eye out for increased pressure, of course, as there's a good chance of edema setting in, maybe even hemorrhage. In the event of either or both of these, we can begin a regimen of regular lumbar drainage and hypertonic solutions." I stood there open-mouthed, listening to this robotic recitation and understanding not a word of it. My eyes turned to Papa lying nearby on the elevated bed, with iodine in his nose and an ice cap on his head, and I felt increasingly annoyed at Dr. Rawls and the highfalutin medical terms that dripped from his tongue like so much late-afternoon staff meeting dialogue. I didn't want to hear about lumbar punctures and spinal mercury manometers. I didn't want to hear about cranial trauma and meningitis and subdural hematomas, about concussion and contusion and compression, and about all the other disasters that Dr. Rawls was babbling on about. I didn't want to hear a series of meaningless statistics and speculations. What I wanted was to push aside this onslaught of medical rambling, to sweep it away like so much unnecessary clutter, and to get right down to the important question: was my father going to be all right? But the fact was, and I knew it even then, in spite of the man's impressive knowledge, the best that Dr. Rawls could offer us when faced with such a question was, "I don't know." Mother must have been just as disgusted with the doctor as I was, because when he left she said, "Well, we'll have to have Harold interpret all that mumbo-jumbo when we see him." At regular intervals throughout the day, we were interrupted by the sudden appearance of doctors, interns, nurses, technicians, orderlies. Papa's temperature was taken, his pulse checked, his respirations counted, his blood pressure measured, and the results dutifully recorded in the chart at the foot of his bed. His eyelids were lifted, and his eyeballs assaulted with lights. His one good leg and his one good arm were repeatedly thumped, his reflexes measured. His heart and lungs were listened to, his chest tapped. The bandages around his thigh were cut away, the wound checked, fresh bandages applied. The same was done to his head. His nostrils and ears received fresh coats of iodine. His ice cap was carted away and brought back bulging with fresh ice. Once or twice he was given an injection of this or that. There seemed an endless parade of white-clad people coming in and out of the room, working over Papa the way all the king's horses and all the king's men tried to put Humpty together again. I prayed these people would be more successful with Papa than all the king's men were with Humpty Dumpty. During those moments when Mother and I were left alone with Papa, we talked almost constantly, sometimes to each other, but mostly to Papa. And all the while we talked, we watched for any small movement, a pressing of the hand, a fluttering of the eyes, a twitching of the lips, anything to tell us that Papa was there and that he was trying to make his way back to us. Chapter 28. Mother allowed me to miss one more day of school so I could stay with her at the hospital. We arranged for Charlotte to drop off my lessons at the nurse's station in the afternoon, which would enable me to remain caught up with my homework. That second day was even longer and more tedious than the first. Mother and I went on talking with Papa about everything we could possibly think of: family news, updates on his patients from Dr. Hal, tidbits of interest from the newspaper, what I was studying in school. I even recited for him some of the Thomas Campion poems I'd memorized that summer as punishment for cutting my hair. Never in my life had I prattled on so much, and the fact that I was speaking to someone who wasn't even conscious made it all the more tiring. About every hour or so, we interrupted these strained ramblings to read long passages to Papa from his Bible. While this saved me from having to think of anything original to say, it was almost even more emotionally taxing than the forced monologues. Papa's Bible was crowded with notes he'd written in the margins in his cramped but tidy script. Dr. Hal often kidded him about his handwriting, saying he ought to work on making it more illegible if he wanted to be respected as a doctor. I used to laugh at that joke, but now it fell flat as I gazed at Papa's Bible notes and wondered whether he had written the last of them. Throughout that long day, the doctors and nurses came and went, the former looking stern and professional, the latter casting us sympathetic smiles. Still, no one could tell us anything definite about Papa's prognosis, and I sensed an aura of apology hanging about these professionals, a silent and embarrassed apology to Mother and me for their inability to predict the future. There was no change in Papa's condition. He went on sleeping and gave us no indication at all that he could hear us, or that he knew we were there. Dr. Hal came around in the late afternoon, shortly after Charlotte dropped off my homework. I was sitting on the floor with an open book in my lap, almost relieved to have this connection to the normal world, my former life, when Dr. Hal entered the room. With some reluctance, I shut the book while Dr. Hal took Papa's pulse, listened to his heart, shined a light in his eyes, and did a few other of those medical things. It was time to return to Papa, to listen to what Dr. Hal had to say. When he finished his cursory examination, Mother motioned him out into the hall. I followed. "I've gotten the opinions of Dr. Rawls and Dr. Murphy, more or less," Mother said evenly, "but I want to know what you think, Harold." Dr. Hal shuffled uneasily. "Well, Lillian, I have to agree with what those two have already told you. We can't make any predictions at this point. We just have to wait and see. I know that's frustrating, believe me, I know. Waiting is the hardest thing to do. But right now, thankfully, things don't look too bad." "Then why isn't he waking up? I can't believe it's a good sign when a man's been unconscious for 2 days. "Actually, Lil, with a head injury like Will's, several days of unconsciousness can pretty much be expected. A coma is a body's way of healing itself. It's not necessarily a bad thing." Mother's shoulders lifted and settled again. "If you say so, Harold. But I can't stop thinking of all those terrible things Dr. Rawls said might still happen. Edema and blood clots and brain hemorrhages and meningitis. And, Harold, what about permanent brain damage? Dr. Rawls said nearly half the people who survive this kind of injury end up damaged for life, while 10% are totally incapacitated. Totally incapacitated, Harold. Just what is William going to wake up to be? What—" "Lillian, listen to me. For your own sake, don't pay too much attention to Dr. Rawls' statistics. His numbers just don't mean that much, not when it comes down to the bottom line, anyway. And you see, the bottom line is this. Every head injury case is unique, or as one of my medical professors used to say, a law unto itself. There isn't one case that's exactly like another, which makes it almost impossible to predict what's going to happen. Just because some people are left with permanent damage doesn't mean that Will is going to end up one of them. It's possible, yes, but let's not assume anything until we have more to go on. Mother's forehead wrinkled, and she lifted sad eyes to Dr. Hal. But it's also possible, isn't it, that he won't wake up at all? He won't die and he won't get better. He'll just go on sleeping. Reluctantly, Dr. Hal agreed. Yes, it's possible. But right now, in William's case, it doesn't appear probable. Chances are good he'll start to come out of the coma in another day or so. And the longer he sleeps? Dr. Hal sighed, as though he'd just been checkmated. The longer he sleeps, the less likely it is he'll wake up. But listen, Lillian, at this point we might as well keep expecting the best. For William's sake, keep your hopes up. Mother gave a brief and tentative smile, but then asked timidly, almost like a child, "But, Harold, can't you just tell me—" "Doctors aren't God, Lillian," Dr. Hal interrupted, anticipating Mother's question. "You, of all people, know that." Mother gazed at Dr. Hal in silence, probably wishing, as I was, that she could pull a definite forecast out of him. Wishing that he would say, "Just a day or two more of sleep and he'll be fine. All the tests indicate there won't be any permanent damage." Even if he couldn't say that, even if he had to say instead, "He won't be waking up again," it would be better than the not knowing. If we knew he was going to remain comatose, or even to die, then we could begin to adjust to our loss. But this not knowing, this dangling in suspense between hope and despair, was almost unbearable. But as Dr. Hal said, he wasn't God, and there wasn't a doctor in the world who was. Only God was God, and only God could decide what would happen to Papa. Dr. Hal laid a hand on Mother's upper arm. "Why don't you and Jenny come home with me now? It's been a long day for both of you." Mother looked at me for my opinion. "Let's stay a while longer, Mama," I said. It was hard to be there, but it was harder to think about leaving. Mother nodded. "Would you mind coming back later this evening, Harold? I know I'm completely neglecting everything at home, but I'd rather stay here with William just now." "Of course," Dr. Hal said. "The children, are they all right?" "Everyone's fine. Well, a little sad and a little confused. Molly keeps asking where you and Will are. It's tough explaining it all to a 3-year-old without telling her too much. Claudia seems more accepting of this situation than Molly. In fact, she tells Molly not to worry because you'll be home soon, and maybe you'll bring them some candy if they're good." Dr. Hal smiled wistfully at the thought. "And how do you think Simon's holding up?" Mother asked. "Harder to tell with him. He doesn't say much, but I think he's scared. You kind of have to expect him to be." "I know they need me at home, but—" "Will needs you here, Lillian. Don't berate yourself for wanting to be with your husband." "Yes, well, maybe I can spend a little extra time with the children tonight, or tomorrow morning, just to reassure them." "All right," Dr. Hal said, shrugging, "but you've got Sally and me to help take care of them, too." "Yes, I know, and I thank you, Harold. It just seems everyone is overburdened right now. You trying to hold down the practice by yourself. Don't worry about that, Lil. And Sally taking care of the children in the house. How's she doing, do you think? Is she managing all right on her own?" "Of course, but then again," Dr. Hal paused to smile, "she's not really on her own. I mean, the neighbor ladies are starting to bring food around and offering to help with chores, and the menfolk are stopping by to see if there's anything that needs fixing. I think Sally's going to have all the help she needs for a while." "Oh," Mother said, "how kind of everyone to help out. I must make a point of thanking them when all this is over." She paused a moment, then added, "Is Sally finding the time to visit Jim?" "She spent an hour with him just this afternoon. The Mobleys volunteered to watch the girls while she was gone." Mother nodded, satisfied. "They've always been good to us, the Mobleys. Is there any news about Jim?" I felt a momentary twinge of guilt whenever anyone mentioned Uncle Jim. From the moment Papa was hurt, very few of my waking thoughts were centered around my uncle. He was still in jail, his future still uncertain, but at least he wasn't hurt, and he wasn't in danger of dying. I couldn't afford to expend any of my energy worrying about someone whose situation seemed relatively safe. All my worrying was done for Papa. Dr. Hal shook his head. "Nothing yet. The lawyers are still working on it." "Poor Sally. I hope she knows something soon." She told Jim all about Will, of course. Mother nodded. Dr. Hal went on. Jim's taken it hard. Broke down and cried right there in the jail cell in front of a dozen other men. He said being behind bars had been almost bearable until it was those same bars keeping him from Will's bedside. He said he'd sure like to be here, but since he can't, he sends his love. Mother smiled weakly, and we sent ours to him. Once we had all been together in one big house that seemed small and crowded at the time. Now all I wanted was for us to be there again, crowded or no, instead of having to send messages of love to places like the city jail and Mercy Hospital. "Well, Harold," Mother sighed, "why don't you pick us up around 8 o'clock or so tonight?" "I'll be here," Dr. Hal assured her, "and don't worry. Try not to worry about anything." We were all talked out, I guess, by the time the first shadows of dusk fell. I was on the floor again, cross-legged, my geography textbook cradled in my lap, my other books scattered on the floor around me. Mother sat in the chair beside Papa's bed and said nothing. She simply sat, holding his hand. Every so often I looked up from my book to take in the scene across the room, my father lying silently on the bed, my mother sitting silently beside him. Mother's face was a mask, offering no clue as to the thoughts running through her mind. I tried to imagine her feelings by picturing myself sitting beside the bed of a wounded Charlie Chaplin or Charles Lindbergh. It was as close as I could come to knowing what it would be like to be in danger of losing the one you loved. And though I knew it wasn't really the same at all, because they were only a dream to me, while Papa was very real to Mother, it gave me some ideas to the depth of Mother's personal tragedy. Will and Lil, she had written all over her school books. Will and Lil. And there had never been anyone else for either of them. Should Papa die, the largest chunk of Mother's life would fall away, and she'd never get it back. It made me dizzy to imagine the wide open space that would enter Mother's life with Papa's absence. A space so large you could get lost in it and never find your way home again. Out in the hallway beyond the open door of Papa's room, the members of the hospital staff passed by in blurs of white. Medicine carts that needed oiling squeaked by, wheelchairs rolled past, stretchers rumbled along. All the hurried movements beyond the door presented a stark contrast to the dimly lighted hush of Papa's room. We were the theater patrons, Mother and I, watching life playing itself out upon the stage, wishing that we too could be part of it. But we were consigned to this place of watching and waiting. The thin blanket spread out across Papa's chest lifted and fell with his every breath. "We have to watch for changes in respiration," one of the nurses had explained to us earlier. "It could be cause for concern if it speeds up or slows down, or especially if it becomes stertorous." When I looked at her blankly, she smiled and said, "That is, it becomes loud or labored, kind of like snoring. That's a bad sign." Since her warning, I'd been intermittently watching Papa breathe. It made me feel that I was doing something to help take care of him. Mother's eyes moved from Papa's face to the slightly opened window and back again. I stared down at the book in my lap, but I didn't read. My mind drifted elsewhere, out of the hospital room and through the city streets toward home. Home where Simon and Claudia and Molly, Aunt Sally and my cousins, and Dr. Hal were. Life was going on there, too. Real life, like the happenings out in the hall. Every day Aunt Sally cooked and cleaned, the older children went to school, the younger children played. Dr. Hal saw patients. The same as always. I missed home. I missed the routines of our lives, all the otherwise unnoticed customs, meals together around the kitchen table, and evenings together on the porch or around the radio, all the untroubled hours of work and play and rest. How sweet all those simple things seemed now. How much I longed for that completely unromantic but loveliest of lives. And how central Papa was to all of it. Papa sitting at his desk in the morning taking care of the first order of the day. Papa whistling as he shaved, as he worked, as he waited for his warm milk at night. Papa sitting beside me on the porch swing, listening patiently to all the small details of my life, as though I was the most important person in the world. It was my Papa's love and his joy and his presence that colored all my days and made them beautiful. If it were all to end now, I thought, it would be a bitter ending. If Papa never awoke, if he were to die tonight, or tomorrow, or the day after that, his last conscious feeling for me would be of anger and disappointment. After all the years of resting secure in his love, I couldn't bear the thought that our relationship would end at such a point. I saw him as he was the night of the raid, peering down at me through narrowed eyes, his face crimson with anger. "Why didn't you tell me?" he had demanded as he shook me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I wanted to defend myself now, to point to his wounds and say, "Because I love you, Papa, because I love you and I didn't want this to happen. I was trying to protect you." I wanted to hear him say it was all right, that he loved me too, that he understood why I didn't tell him about the raid on Sioux City. In spite of my determination not to cry, I felt the tears pressing against my eyes. I kept my head bent over my geography book so Mother wouldn't see. I peered hard at the open pages, but they suddenly appeared as disjointed as a kaleidoscope in motion. Then 2 tears slithered down my cheeks and landed with a splash on the map of the United States in my lap. I thought that in another moment I would have to give up and simply give in to the grief, but before I could break down completely into uncontrollable sobs, my sorrow was interrupted by an unexpected commotion. The sound came through the partly opened window, from out on the hospital grounds. All at once there was a blur of voices, people talking in low tones, a ripple of laughter, then the blaring of instruments and a chorus of off-key voices. Mother straightened up as though someone had called her name, and she looked over at me. We frowned at each other across the room. "Now what on earth?" Mother began, but before saying more, she settled Papa's hand gently on the bed and rose from the chair. I brushed away the tears on my cheeks, pushed my geography book aside, and scrambled up from the floor to join her at the window. We stood there motionless, not quite believing what we saw. Out in the pale evening light, gathered on the leaf-strewn grounds, was a picket line. A whole string of people milled about, carrying signs and singing, but it wasn't a picket line like the one that had marched and sung about solidarity in front of the grain mill. It wasn't a picket line like the ones that gathered in cities across the country to demonstrate against hunger and unemployment and low wages and unfair working hours. No, this was something altogether different from the uprisings that had plagued our nation for months. "It's some of the people from Sioux City, Mama," I whispered. "That's Joe blowing on the harmonica, and Oscar playing the guitar. And the man playing the accordion, they call him Bellowing Bob. Down at the camp they sit on cinder blocks while they play, and sometimes Bob gets to pumping so hard he falls right off the block. Oh, and the woman there holding the baby, that's Mrs. Everhart, and the little baby is Caroline. You remember, she's the one Papa delivered not too long ago. And that's Mrs. Everhart's 2 boys, and her husband, too. Standing right behind them is Sherman Brown. He's the one who pulled stork duty when Caroline was born because Mr. Everhart was too nervous to come himself. And there's Dick Mason. He came to the house when his brother-in-law was run over by the train. Remember, Mama? He was the first one ever to come to our house from Sioux City. And look, there's Shoes and Long John and Mr. Lucky, and that's Mr. Lucky's dog, T-Bone. The very people who, by staying quiet, I hadn't stepped forward to help. Where they had come from and how they had found their way to Papa at the hospital, I had no idea. To my shame, I realized that they had been brushed aside right along with my worries about Uncle Jim. I hadn't even worried what had become of them, so caught up was I in my own father's welfare. After the raid, they had simply disappeared from my mind as quickly as they had disappeared from the river bank, without one thought or prayer from me. But now, suddenly, here they were, singing Amazing Grace, and holding makeshift signs on cardboard with charcoal lettering. "Get well soon, Doc Ada," and "We're pulling for you," and "God bless you, Doc." Even T-Bone wore a sandwich board, one side of which said, "Doc Ada, friend to man and beast," and the other, "T-Bone loves Sawbones." They were a motley crew, dirtier and more disheveled than ever. Their clothing was torn, their hair matted and flying in all directions, and all 10 of Long John's toes stuck out of the ends of his tattered shoes. They also carried the wounds they had suffered in the raid. An arm in a sling here, a black eye there, a hand or a foot or a knee wrapped in crude bandages. Even their voices were harsh and raspy, still bearing the effects from the smoke of the fire. They were the sorriest group of musicians I had ever seen, and yet they made the sweetest music I had ever heard. Mother, who hadn't spoken up till now, remarked quietly, "Oh, Virginia, aren't they dreadful?" But she said it with a kind of awe. Her chin quivered, and her eyes glazed over with the first tears I'd seen since our ordeal began, and in those few moments Mother must have understood what Papa saw in these people Jesus called the least of the brethren. She must have seen what it was that took Papa back again and again to their camp to be among them. And I did too. When I looked at them as they stood there in their peculiar picket line, I saw the long-handled spoons that Papa had told me about. The instruments and the voices and the improvised signs and the tears on people's faces, these all were long-handled spoons, held up now to Papa's lips with the life-giving stew that Papa couldn't reach for himself. Unlike me, these people understood the riddle of those strange utensils, had probably understood it long ago, and had somehow, in their own way, been feeding Papa across the table all along. Suddenly, Mr. Donner, the hospital administrator, appeared on the grounds, taking long strides toward the group while waving his arms dramatically. "This is a hospital," he cried in an angry stage whisper. "We must have quiet here. Either you leave at once or I'll call the sheriff." At that, Mother flung open the window as wide as it would go and shouted through the screen, "Mr. Donner, you will do no such thing. I think the sheriff's done quite enough, thank you. These people have come to sing, and sing they will." I couldn't believe it. Here was my very proper mother, standing arms akimbo, yelling at the top of her voice to the hospital administrator. Mr. Donner, I think, couldn't quite believe it either. He looked around frantically for the source of this unexpected censure, until he finally spotted Mother in the window of Papa's room. The Sioux City singers had stopped singing, and Mr. Donner's suddenly timid voice came to us from out of the abrupt silence. "Mrs. Ada," he stuttered apologetically, I was just trying—" "You leave those people be," Mother warned. "Let them do what they've come to do." The man, red-faced, glanced at the dubious singers. He did a double-take when bellowing Bob, the accordionist, bowed and tipped his cap. Mr. Donner responded with a frown. Then, moving in his long-legged strides toward the window where we stood, he didn't stop until he practically had his nose pressed up against the screen. "But, Mrs. Ada," he said as he ran his thin fingers through his hair, "I have to think of the other patients. We can't have these people," he spat out the last word as though he considered it a misnomer, "disturbing the residents of this hospital." "Then they will just have to sing more quietly," Mother replied adamantly. She had that look on her face that meant her decision was final. Mr. Donner took out a handkerchief from his breast pocket, wiped nervously at his brow, and sighed heavily. He looked from Mother to the singers and back to Mother again. "All right," he conceded. "They can sing, but only very quietly and only for a short time." Then, gathering up the pieces of his shattered authority, he added sternly, "And no instruments." As the administrator stalked off, Mother slipped me a placid smile. "I knew I'd be glad one day that Father funded this wing," she said. Actually, she'd been proud all along, but now Grandfather Foster's generosity had proved really useful. I smiled at Mother in return and took her hand. The Sioux City singers moved closer to Papa's window, and Joe O'Hanlon stepped forward, took off his cap and squeezed it, together with his harmonica, in his large hands. He looked at me and nodded a greeting, then said to Mother, "The doctor was always coming round doing for us, ma'am. We wanted to do something for him in return. It ain't much, but we know how he favors music. We thought he might like a song or two." Mother took a deep breath before speaking, appearing to collect herself. When she spoke, her voice was strong and even. "I thank you good people for your thoughtfulness," she said. "I wonder whether I might ask a favor of you." "Of course, Mrs. Ada," Joe agreed eagerly. Dr. Ada had— Mother stopped and corrected herself. "Dr. Ada has a special penchant for Christmas carols. I know it's not yet the season, but I wonder whether you might—" Mother stopped when she saw each face in the crowd brighten into a smile. "It would be our pleasure, ma'am," Joe replied. He returned his cap to his head, and as self-appointed conductor of the group, instructed, "Let's start with O Come, Emmanuel. I heard the doc whistling that one enough to reckon it's one of his favorites. Listen up now, here's the note." He tooted on his harmonica, an effort that did little to get the group on key, and in the next moment Papa's room was filled with something resembling the songs of Christmas. We listened to those a cappella whisperings for the next half hour, while night settled over the hospital grounds. And as the darkness came on, a certain light slipped in as well, a light that began to dispel the inner blackness of our fears, for the singers brought Christmas to us. It didn't matter that it was October and not December, or that what was tumbling from the sky was autumn leaves and not snow. Christmas had come. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Emmanuel, God with us, not up in the sky somewhere beyond the twinkling stars, not so far away that the earth appears a little speck of dirt hung slipshod in the universe, but here, right here, in this city, in this place, in this room. O come, thou dayspring, come and cheer our spirits by thine advent here. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight. I had wanted to shout at him, to reach my hand up and rattle heaven, to demand his attention. "Oh God, dear God, I'm here." But it seemed only futile, and I questioned his ability to hear me, to see me, to answer me. He who was up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. But then, suddenly, unexpectedly, the people from Sioux City had slipped onto the hospital grounds, and in spite of the rags they called clothes, in spite of their poverty, in spite of the failures that clung to them like so much lint on an old jacket, they had brought God with them. When the notes of the last song subsided, Joe O'Hanlon tucked his harmonica into his jacket pocket and said, "Well, Mrs. Ada, I reckon we'd better be moving along." Mother took a small step closer to the window and placed her hand on the screen. "I wonder, would you—" she started. She had the same look on her face as when she sometimes watched Papa go off to Sioux City, that look of wanting to call him back but wondering whether she should. "Well," she continued, "would it be an imposition to ask you to come back tomorrow?" Oscar Selinsky strummed a chord on his guitar. "We'll be here, ma'am," he promised. Mother thanked them, and good nights were exchanged all around. "God bless you, Mrs. Ada. See you tomorrow, Virginia. Take good care of the doc. We'll be praying." "Sleep well, everyone," Mother called out. They turned to go, and too late I wondered to ask them where they were going. Where they had come from, where they would sleep. I never did find out. Chapter 29. Mother sent me back to school starting Friday of that week. Of course I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay with Papa. Mother tried to console me by saying I could come to the hospital straight from school and spend the rest of the afternoon and evening there with her. She instructed me on where and when to catch the trolley and gave me the nickel fare in the morning before I left the house. That first day back at school, I felt like the bearded lady at the circus, a misfit to be stared and gawked at. Of course my friends Charlotte and Rosemary and Jean welcomed me back into the fold, and my teacher, Miss Howard, pulled me aside and offered words of consolation and encouragement. But most of the kids regarded me from a distance, with furtive stares and barely concealed whispers. "Her pa got shot. His head's all bashed in like an old pumpkin." But the one that really bothered me was, "They say he might die any minute now." The fragmented whispers followed me wherever I went. I clenched my jaw and forced myself not to cry, thinking, let them say what they want. What do they know anyway? Danny Dysinger tried repeatedly to catch my eye in class, but I ignored him. He had wanted to help in his own way, I knew, but I couldn't get it out of my mind that it may have been Danny's own father who wielded the blow to Papa's head when he was already down. Good old Charlotte spent most of the time between classes and at recess with her arm around my shoulder, like a mother hen tucking a chick beneath her wing. She didn't offer me any sympathy, for which I was grateful, but repeatedly made statements that began with, "When your pa gets better," or "When your pa gets home." She didn't entertain the possibility of any other outcome, and she wouldn't let me either. Saturday gave me some relief from the curiosity of my classmates, though it was another day spent from morning till night at the hospital. I realized on Saturday that during those hours I was away from Papa, it was easier to hope for his recovery, much easier than when I was with him. Because when I stood beside his bed and looked upon the gaunt and vacant face that didn't resemble my father at all, I'd think, how can he possibly ever be Papa again? Sunday morning Mother insisted that we all go to church, and Reverend Winchell's prayer, "O Lord, comfort the good doctor's wife and children at this their hour of trial," and the sympathy of our fellow congregants just about killed us. "Oh, Lillian, you're holding up so well. I remember when my Harry died. God will never give us more than we can bear. There's a purpose in this, someday you'll see. And your children so young, but God takes care of his own. You won't be alone, Mrs. Ada." Mother and I dragged ourselves to the hospital that afternoon with the condolences of our fellow churchgoers hanging like chains around our necks and threatening to choke us. "They mean well, Virginia," Mother explained. "Try not to let their words bother you." But bother me they did, and I was in a deep funk until early evening when some unexpected guests showed up. Mother and I had just returned from supper in the hospital cafeteria when Charlotte and Mrs. Bessick appeared in the doorway with small cloth bags in their hands, like a couple of trick-or-treaters. Only instead of asking for handouts, they were bearing gifts, and instead of being all made up, Mrs. Bessick was alarmingly colorless. I think she knew she'd offend Mother if she came around wearing her usual rouge and lipstick. My friend and her mother stood in the doorway awkwardly, not quite sure what to do, until my own mother finally said, "Mrs. Bessick, Lottie, how nice of you to come. Please come in." Mother stood to greet Mrs. Bessick, and all the while the latter was apologizing for having shown up unexpectedly. "We called your house," she explained, "and Mrs. Dubbin told us you were still here and to just come on over." "Of course," Mother responded. "I'm so glad you did." Her words surprised me because I was well aware of her opinion of Mrs. Bessick. And yet I should have known that Mother would hardly turn up her nose and send the woman away. Charlotte and I smiled at each other as our mothers exchanged pleasantries. "Won't you sit down?" Mother invited, pointing to the one chair beside Papa's bed. "I can get some more chairs." "Oh, no, really, I can't stay," Mrs. Bessick interrupted. "I just wanted to bring Lottie around and give you this." She pulled out of the bag something all wrapped up in wax paper and handed it to Mother. "I made some bread this afternoon. It's banana bread. I don't know whether you like it." "Why, yes, of course," Mother said, accepting the loaf. "Banana bread is one of our family favorites. Thank you so much." "You know I hate to cook, Virginia," Charlotte blurted out, "but I tried to make you some cookies. They're chocolate chip. I don't think they turned out so good, but anyway, here they are." "I'm sure they're very good," I said as I took the little bag she handed me, though in fact I could imagine she had forgotten some vital ingredient like the sugar. But I didn't care. Mrs. Bessick appeared flustered as she stood near Papa's bed. She kept dropping her eyes, seeming afraid to look at him. "I wanted to tell you, Mrs. Ada," she said, clenching her hands together, "that I really am sorry about what's happened to Dr. Ada. He always treated me good whenever I came to him with a problem, or whenever Lottie's been sick. And, well, I'm not a praying woman, Mrs. Ada, but ever since I heard the doc was hurt, I've been asking God to help him. Lots of good people are praying for him, and, well—" Her voice trailed off, as though she'd simply run out of words. Mother smiled at her then, not a false smile prompted by propriety, but a genuine smile. "Thank you for your prayers, Mrs. Bessick," she said gently. "That means so much to me, and it will mean a great deal to Dr. Ada, too, when he wakes up and learns you are praying for him." Mrs. Bessick's face flushed slightly, but she returned Mother's smile. "Well," she said, sounding relieved, "I'll be back when visiting hours are over to pick up Lottie." "Are you sure you won't stay a while?" Mother asked. "Thank you, but I can't." "Lottie," she said, turning to Charlotte and me, "you be good and don't bother Mrs. Ada." "I'll be good, Mama. I'll meet you out front at 8. "All right, Mama. And Mama?" "Yes, Lottie." "It's Charlotte." Mrs. Bessick sighed and exchanged a knowing glance with Mother before walking out of the room. Mother stood there holding the loaf of banana bread in her hand and staring at the doorway through which Mrs. Bessick had just passed. There was a gap a mile wide between the two women, but I decided Mrs. Bessick had just laid the first brick in the foundation of the bridge that might one day connect them. Charlotte walked over to Papa's bedside and looked down at him with a sorrowful expression in her eyes. "He doesn't look very much like his old self, does he?" she asked quietly. She didn't wait for an answer before looking up at Mother and saying, "But don't worry, Mrs. Ada. He's going to be all right. I can feel it in my bones." "Thank you, Charlotte," Mother said. She finally placed the banana bread on the side table and settled herself in the chair beside Papa. I'm not sure she put much trust in Charlotte's bones, but she smiled at my friend as though she were Dr. Rawls himself, telling her Papa was bound to wake up any minute now. "You want to take a walk, Virginia, just around the halls?" Charlotte asked. I looked at Mother. "Can we, Mama?" "All right, but do it quietly. This is a hospital, remember." When my friend and I headed for the door, Mother called, "You'll be back in time for the singers, won't you?" "Of course," I said. "You want to hear the singers, don't you, Charlotte?" "The Sioux City singers?" Charlotte asked. "Sure I do. We'll be back soon, Mrs. Ada." Out in the corridor, we threw our arms around each other and started to walk. "Think we'll see anything gory?" Charlotte asked expectantly. "No," I said, shaking my head. "They pretty much keep the gory stuff hidden as much as possible." The only time I got to be in a hospital, besides right now, was when my great-aunt Bernice was dying of a gallbladder attack. I only got to see her before she was dead, though, and not after, so it was hardly worth going. I remembered the dead man I'd seen in the street during the riot in front of the grain mill. "Well, I can tell you, Charlotte, people look a whole lot better alive than dead," I assured her. "But if you're really all that interested in it, maybe you should think about becoming an undertaker." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not going to become anything. I just want to get married. I spun the globe last night even though you weren't there, and you know where it said I'm going on my honeymoon? Saudi Arabia. Can you beat that? Maybe I'm going to marry one of those rich sheiks over there. You know, the ones that wear those towels over their heads even though it's hotter than blazes." We walked on, talking about our dreams, our hopes for romance, our wish that a handsome new boy would enroll at school and fall madly in love with us. So for a time, with Charlotte at my side, I almost forgot where I was and why I was there. Friends can do that, bring a bit of real comfort in a time of distress like balm on a wound. When I saw the clock above the nurse's desk and realized the Sioux City singers would be performing soon, I steered us back to Papa's room. The group had already arrived by the time we joined Mother at the window. "Do you want to munch on some cookies while we listen?" I asked Charlotte. She said she did, so we each grabbed a couple from the bag. We offered one to Mother, but she declined, saying she'd already had a slice of banana bread and it was delicious. Charlotte and I both bit into a cookie. They were pretty good, after all, and chewed contentedly while the singers fumbled for their key and started to sing. Our chewing slowed down, then stopped altogether as we listened to the group singing about the little town of Bethlehem. Charlotte moved her head in time to the music and seemed to enjoy the show. After another song or two, she asked, "Do you think they can do 'I Found $1 Million Baby in the 5 and 10 cent store'?" "Well," I explained, "mostly they just do hymns and Christmas carols and stuff like that." Charlotte stared at the group a moment, then lifted her shoulders in a shrug. "Well," she replied decidedly, "that's all right. I like 'em anyway." Good old Charlotte. Chapter 30. Every day, as soon as the bell rang at the end of the last class, I gathered my books, reluctantly disengaged myself from Charlotte's arm, and ran to catch the trolley to the hospital. It was the time of year when everyone was making little bonfires of the autumn leaves in their yards, and on those afternoons when I stood on the street corner waiting for the trolley, the scent of burning leaves hung heavy in the air. Normally I loved that distinct fragrance of autumn, and inhaled it as deeply as I did the aroma of spring flowers, but now the scent of those innocent fires conjured up in my mind images of destruction, of Sioux City in blazes, of Papa being beaten against the backdrop of the flaming shanties. Even autumn was a stranger, and not the season I had always known. I was glad when the trolley came and swallowed me up into the scent of my fellow passengers' various perfumes and tobaccos. But my relief at escaping the burning leaves was always short-lived. As soon as the driver shut the doors and the car jerked forward into motion, I remembered where I was going. I wasn't escaping the Sioux City fire. I was heading right for it. With the passing of each block, with every turning of the trolley's wheels, my fears grew. Maybe, by the time I get there, he'll be dead, I'd think. Or maybe he's dying now, this very minute, and he'll be gone before I arrive. By the time I'd reach the hospital, I'd be so wound up I could hardly breathe. I'd hurry through the lobby and past the nurse's station to Papa's room, but before I came to the door, I'd stop and take a deep breath, trying to prepare myself for what I'd see. Every day it was the same. Papa was still lying in the bed, his chest still rising and falling. Not yet, I'd think, light-headed with relief. He's still here. I can still hope. And yet as the days passed, the chances of his waking up became slimmer. Edema set in on the 6th day, causing pressure on his brain, which was relieved through regular lumbar drainage. He was also given repeated injections of dextrose, a hypertonic solution used to deplete fluid in the tissues, thereby combating the edema. While Papa's fluid intake was restricted, he was watched for over-dehydration, and the whole routine became a delicate balancing act. And of course all the while, we were still on the lookout for blood clots, hemorrhaging, convulsions, meningitis, and so forth, any or all of which could develop at any moment. Although at first I hadn't wanted to hear all the medical mumbo-jumbo Dr. Rawls insisted on throwing at us, I eventually made up my mind to try to understand as much as I could about what was happening to my father. Ignorance may be bliss, but I could no longer pretend that Dr. Rawls' big medical terms had nothing to do with Papa. They had everything to do with Papa. And so I asked Dr. Hal again and again to explain Papa's symptoms and the measures taken to relieve them. And again, Dr. Hal patiently obliged, always ending his simple lectures with an assurance or two that Papa would come around. Still the days slipped by, and Papa didn't come around. Though they didn't downgrade his prognosis from guarded, the doctors and nurses began to pass in and out of the room as solemnly as if my father were already laid out in his coffin. After a while I no longer looked to any of them, save Dr. Hal, for reassurance, but they seemed determined not to give it. During those interminable hours at the hospital, I turned often to Mother for consolation and strength. I knew she was afraid, of course. How could she be otherwise? But if she gave up hope, then I too would give up hope, and even without my saying so, she knew that. At the same time, she needed me to encourage her as well. We were like two playing cards leaning up against each other to form a teepee, one thin paper edge touching the other in so fragile a construction that the slightest movement of air could topple it. And if one of us fell, the other would certainly fall as well. So almost unconsciously, we buoyed each other up with a certain simple liturgy of hope. I'd say, and it'd be a statement, not a question, "It's still possible he'll wake up, isn't it, Mama?" And she'd respond quite confidently, "Yes, Virginia, with God anything is possible." Even as Papa's recovery became more and more improbable, the fact didn't change that with God anything is possible. That was the only hope we had. While Mother and I held each other up, the two of us were together reinforced by the daily appearance of the Sioux City Singers. Every evening at 6 o'clock they gathered outside Papa's window, and every evening the group grew larger as more and more of the scattered residents of the burned-out shantytown learned of my father's plight and came back to offer what help they could. They had somehow scraped up a couple of hymnals so they wouldn't have to improvise so much on the words of the songs. Like clockwork they assembled there, minus the signs, the guitar, and the accordion, and though they appeared weary and hungry and almost without hope for their own lives, for half an hour every evening they put all thought of themselves aside and sang to Papa. The days were cool, and the nights were downright chilly, but not even the cold deterred the singers. They hugged themselves and warmed their fingers under their armpits and stamped their feet between songs, and sometimes their breath wafted like little clouds in the early autumn air, but on they sang. Mother opened Papa's window only a crack when the Sioux City Singers came around. Then she and I put on sweaters and pulled an extra blanket up around Papa's chin to keep him warm. Whenever we did this, I thought of all the blankets I had collected for our friends in the camp, and I was sad to think that, before the cold of winter had even had a chance to set in, all those blankets had become fodder for the sheriff's fire. All except, perhaps, the one that Dr. Hal had used as a hammock to carry Papa to the car after he was wounded. Mother and I weren't the only ones to gain encouragement from the Sioux City Singers. Their arrival soon became a ritual that other patients and their families looked forward to as well. Shortly before 6, we'd hear people in the hall say, "It's almost time," and wheelchairs were pushed closer to windows, and those people who were ambulatory shuffled in their hospital slippers down to the day room to listen. Even some of the nurses and orderlies paused in their work for a few minutes to turn an ear toward the singers on the lawn. On occasion we'd hear someone call out, "Would you mind singing?" and one song or another was requested. The singers would riffle through the hymn books till they found the song. Then Joe O'Hanlon tooted a note on his harmonica, and the choir quietly serenaded their grateful audience. I think even Mr. Donner, the hospital administrator, came to appreciate the singers. He never said so, but once I saw him at his own window in the opposite hospital wing, his hands behind his back, his head nodding slowly in time with the music. And every evening after they sang, before they went away to wherever it was they went away to, they stopped to ask about Papa. "Any change for the better, Mrs. Ada?" "None yet, but we don't give up hope." "He's a tough one," someone would offer. "He'll pull through yet." And someone else would say, "Any man deserves to live, it's Doc Ada." And still another, "I'd trade places with him if I could. He means that much to us." Words of consolation, encouragement, prayers were passed through the crack of the open window. Then, "We'll be back tomorrow, same as always. Take good care of the doc." Papa's Bible, which Mother and I continued to read aloud, reminded me that God was near, not on a distant throne. Not only near, but here. Here in the room where Papa lay, where Mother and I spent so many hours waiting and wondering. But while I prayed for Papa, I remembered the Lindbergh baby, and that in spite of the prayers of thousands, he hadn't been returned home safely. He had been found dead and decomposing in a field, and I knew that God wasn't obligated to answer my prayers for Papa in the way I wanted him to, either. Papa had told me, and I thought often of his words, he wasn't afraid to die, that when he died he knew he'd just be going home. I believed that, too, and yet I wasn't ready to let Papa go. We still needed him here with us, Mother and Simon and the girls and me, and his patients needed him. So many people needed him. How could God take him from us now? But I knew if Papa could speak, he'd say, "Now look, Jenny, God knows what's right. What we can't understand we have to take on faith." I'd try. If Papa died, I'd try to take it on faith because surely I would never understand. Time dragged on, and every hour seemed a day, and every day a week. Restless nights were followed by weary days at school, then the trolley ride to the hospital, the afternoons and evenings with Papa, the nightly assembling from out of nowhere of the faithful Sioux City Singers. Each time I entered Papa's room, I looked for some small change for the better. I watched for any movement he might make, listened for any word he might try to speak, but there were none. Rather, he seemed only to grow thinner, paler, weaker, as though fading away. The morning of the 14th day was gray and overcast, adding dismay to my already struggling spirits. Everything always seemed worse when the skies covered over, the sun hidden. Just as I reached the bottom of the stairs on my way to breakfast, I overheard Mother and Dr. Hal talking at the kitchen table. I could see them, but they didn't see me. I sat down on the stairs to listen. "Why isn't he waking up, Harold?" Mother asked. "I don't know, Lillian," Dr. Hal said, so quietly I almost couldn't hear. "You expected him to be awake by now, didn't you?" "I thought he probably would have come out of the coma by now, yes." "It's not a good sign, is it?" "It's not necessarily a bad sign, Lil." "Level with me, Harold." "I'm telling you what I know." There was a moment of silence, then Mother said, Dr. Rawls and that other doctor, Dr. Murphy, they must be doing something wrong. They're doing everything they can. What about surgery, Harold? Some sort of operation? Surgery isn't called for, Lil. There's nothing a surgeon can do. We don't know the exact injuries to the brain, but opening up Will's skull and taking a look inside isn't going to tell us any more than what we already know. As a doctor's wife, you must have heard it 1,000,000 times. Medicine is an art, not an exact science. That's what they were always telling us in medical school, and I've since found it to be true. Healing the human body isn't like fixing a broken car. I wish it were that easy, but it just isn't so. There are too many variables, too many unique complications to each case. But you have to believe that everything that can be done for Will is being done. There was another quiet moment before Mother said, "It's just hard for me to stand by. It seems I ought to be doing more." We all feel that way, Lillian. A situation like this leaves everyone feeling helpless. I know you told me that even if he opens his eyes, he may still be in a coma, may still be unaware of everything around him. But I really feel strongly, Harold, that if he would just open his eyes, I could get through to him somehow. Well, it would be a good step forward if he'd open his eyes, but like I said, I know. We can't know at this point how much permanent damage. Mother's voice trailed off. The legs of her chair scraped against the kitchen floor as she rose to pour herself another cup of coffee. 14 days, Harold. 2 whole weeks, and he hasn't even opened his eyes once. Well, granted, it's more common for people to open their eyes early on, whether they're out of the coma or not, but it's not unknown for people to go 2 weeks without opening their eyes. I heard of— Harold, Mother interrupted. She settled her coffee cup loudly on the counter and stood looking out the window above the sink. "We're grasping at straws, aren't we? I mean," she turned to look at Dr. Hal, "you don't really have much hope left, do you?" Dr. Hal sat still as a stone, like a child playing statue at the sight of a bee. As though, if he were perfectly quiet, he might somehow blend into the scenery, go unnoticed and not get stung. But slowly, very slowly, he lifted his face toward Mother, but what he said I couldn't hear, he spoke so low. Mother's face, though, told me what my ears had failed to pick up. Dr. Hal was losing his grip on hope. He pushed back his chair from the table, said a few more words to Mother, then left the kitchen. When he passed me in the hall, I looked up at him from where I sat on the stairs. Our eyes met, but only briefly. He turned abruptly away so that I wouldn't see what was written on those 2 dark mirrors. But I already knew. Mother had had a premonition. She had stood at the door with her hand upon the screen watching Papa go, fearing there was something there in Sioux City that would keep him from ever coming back. And now her fears appeared to be justified. After that, I dragged my heavy emotions with me all through the day, from the first morning bell to the last afternoon bell, when I was finally able to leave school and go to the hospital. The sky had remained overcast all day, and only during that brief ride did the sun momentarily discover a break in the clouds, pushing its golden shimmering rays earthward from heaven. Aunt Sally's ladders. I looked for angels. How I longed to see angels coming to help. But then I remembered. Aunt Sally said those sunbeams were also the ladders that souls climbed up to heaven. I didn't cry out, and I didn't feel fear. Rather, what filled my heart was the greatest sadness I'd ever known. "Oh, Papa," I thought. "Don't go, Papa, please don't go." The clouds shifted, filling in the gap, and the sun withdrew the fingers with which it had touched the earth. I was sure then that Papa was gone. He had climbed up the ladder of light, and the sunbeam had been pulled back up into heaven behind him, the door to heaven shut and padlocked as Papa disappeared inside. The trolley rumbled on its way. A middle-aged woman with a Pekingese got on and plopped down in the seat beside me, holding the small dog in her lap. I offered her a wan smile, but the woman sniffed and didn't return it. Her haughtiness, which at any other time wouldn't bother me, was almost enough to make me break down and cry. It was a busy hour for the trolley, with people getting on and off at every stop, filling up the seats and even standing in the aisle. Most of them were traveling home from work, from shopping, from appointments. I envied them, going about what I imagined to be the mundane routines of their lives, uninterrupted by something as awful, as final, as death. I felt cut off from them all, isolated by my grief, the only one among them touched by tragedy. If only one of them, I thought, would turn around and see me and know that something was wrong. If only I could say, "My papa's dead," so that they might answer, "You don't know for sure yet. Don't say that until you know for sure." But no one noticed me, and I had to go on looking out the window and waiting for my stop as though nothing in the world were wrong. When I got off the trolley in front of the hospital, my knees were so weak they threatened to buckle beneath me and leave me in a heap on the sidewalk. But I mustered up whatever strength I could find and managed to drag myself beyond the double-glass doors into the lobby. The sterile smell of disinfectant assaulted me and turned my stomach. I scanned the room. The lobby was quiet and orderly. No one rushed about as though someone had just died. The nurse at the front desk smiled in my direction when she noticed me. She wouldn't have done that, I thought, if Papa were gone. And indeed, in spite of my fears, when I reached his room I found Mother sitting placidly beside the sleeping figure of my father, the same as always. The tableau was the same. It hadn't changed. I had expected a different scene, was so sure that the curtain had opened on a new act. But you were wrong, I told myself. The sunbeam came, but Papa didn't climb up it. I gazed upon Papa's sleeping figure with quiet acceptance, thinking of how I had always tried to write the outcome of the story, by spinning the globe, by dreaming and wishing, by fearing and doubting, always trying to set the storyline, always trying to lay out the plot. Yet I could speculate and guess and conjure all I wanted, but in the end, the fact remained that I wasn't the author of the play. Someone else was, thankfully. "How is he, Mama?" I asked quietly. Mother closed the Bible in her lap. "No different," she replied. "I'm glad you're here." After an hour, a cold, sparse rain began to fall, and I was afraid our friends from Sioux City might not come. But they came, improvising as always. Instead of umbrellas, they held leaves of newspapers over their heads. Only Mrs. Everhart stayed away to keep baby Caroline protected from the damp chill, though Mr. Everhart was there with the two boys. "You'll catch your death of cold," Mother warned the singers. "Perhaps for tonight you should—" A barrage of mild protests interrupted her. "A herd of wild horses wouldn't keep us away, Mrs. Ada. Gotta see how the doc's doing. It wouldn't feel right not coming round like always. A little bit of rain never hurt no one." And so, huddled beneath the dripping papers, they sang. Dick Mason and Joe O'Hanlon and Oscar Selinsky and Bellowing Bob's Barbaro. Alice Hunt and her friend Mrs. Conley, their husbands and all their children, Steele O'Neill and Shoes and Long John and Sherman Brown, Mr. Lucky and T-Bone, who contributed an occasional yelp, and a number of faces that I didn't recognize, whiskered faces, dirt-smudged faces, gaunt faces, weary faces. But to me, the faces of angels nevertheless. I decided then that these so-called good-for-nothing loafers, these red vermin, these human parasites and pampered poverty rats, these very ones must have been the angels that climbed down the sunray ladder that afternoon to bring us the hope of heaven. I still think so, because that evening, sometime during the second stanza of O Holy Night, Papa opened his eyes. Epilogue. I have always attributed Papa's recovery to the work of God, of course, but I've never questioned that he chose to send some of his healing grace through that unlikely group of musicians. Papa said he didn't hear the singing until after he woke up, but the funny thing was, as soon as he opened his eyes, he turned his head toward the window where the Sioux City singers were gathered. Mother and I knew at once that the opening of his eyes wasn't just a reflex, but that Papa was aware, that he had made a connection with the waking world, and he was back with us. From the day he opened his eyes, Papa's recovery was steady but slow. All through that long winter and the following spring, he struggled to regain speech, movement, and dexterity. At first he spoke as though his mouth were full of cotton, but that eventually improved. Some words gave him trouble for a long time, but one word he could pronounce without difficulty from the beginning was my name. I just about choked on my joy every time I heard him call me Jenny. Sometime early on in Papa's convalescence, Mother and I confessed to him how frightened we had been when day after day went by and he didn't wake up. Mother, in an uncharacteristic attempt at humor, chided, "If you were going to wake up anyway, at least you could have done it sooner and saved us all a great deal of worry." To which Papa quipped, "Now, Lillian, you can't blame a doctor for grabbing a little extra sleep when he can. That was the first uninterrupted sleep I've had since I hung out my shingle." I also confessed to Papa my fear that he would die while still angry with me. Papa thought about that for what seemed a long while. Finally, he took my hand and said, "Jenny, you were becoming a lovely young lady so fast I forgot that in some ways you were still a little girl. You were a little girl faced with a terrible decision the night of the fire, a decision that would have been hard for anyone to make. I know now why you chose not to tell me about the raid. If I'd been in your shoes, I'd have done the same thing for my own father." "Then you're not angry with me anymore, Papa, about what happened that night?" "Of course not, Jenny. I stopped being angry the minute I reached Sioux City and saw the fire. Then I was angry at the people who pulled the raid, but not at you. I knew you were just trying to protect me." "That's right, Papa, that's right. I was just trying to protect you." "I'm so sorry you had to be afraid I'd die angry with you. But I'm glad I'm here to tell you that you mustn't ever think that way again. I've told you before, and I don't want you to forget, that there's nothing greater than my love for you. You understand that, don't you, Jenny?" "Oh, yes, Papa," I cried, throwing my arms around him, "but I'm awfully glad you're here to tell me again." Life began in earnest, then, to settle back into a normal routine. For me, that meant going to school, doing chores, visiting Charlotte, and spinning the globe, even though I no longer took the game seriously. One thing that didn't resume, however, was my laboring over the piano. While I was visiting Papa in the hospital, Mother realized I didn't have time to practice. She called Miss Cole to tell her that my lessons would have to be put on hold indefinitely, though no doubt all three of us knew they'd never start up again. I think I heard the echoes of Miss Cole's sigh of relief from all the way across town. Simon continued taking lessons and went on to become quite skilled, and later even Claudia and Molly showed more talent for the instrument than I ever had. Mother must have been satisfied that 3 of her 4 children exhibited talent, because she never again suggested that I take music lessons, and I never did. Papa continued to improve, though he was never able to walk again without leaning heavily on a cane. The bullet that shattered his thigh bone left him with a nasty limp, and his hands were never quite as strong as they had once been, but since he wasn't a surgeon, that didn't seem to matter too much when it came to his work. He resumed his medical practice in the summer of 1933, and his first rounds included a trip to Sioux City. By that time, the little community down by the river had been re-established for some months. The charred remains of the burned-out camp had been dragged away, the ashes raked over, and new scraps of tin and wood, whatever one could lay a hand on, had been hauled to the riverside and fashioned into shanties. The town was built up roughly along the same dirt roads, except that the main street was renamed Roosevelt Boulevard, a designation that evoked greater hope than Hoover Avenue ever did. Those who made their homes in the camp were largely those who had been there before. They came back to Sioux City simply because they still had nowhere else to go. Also, the Sioux line kept bringing new residents while it continued to carry some of the transients away. Sometime that spring, the railroad brought back the missing banjo player, so the Sioux City trio once again became a quartet. I accompanied Papa the first time he went limping back into the camp. He was no doubt heard before he was seen. He approached Sioux City whistling "Joy to the World," slightly off-key as usual, but loud and clear. You would have thought he was the King of England the way those people flocked to greet him. We'd no sooner passed the "Welcome to Sioux City" sign, the original placard still hung from the same tree, when one person after another started hollering the Doc Ada was back. As word traveled quickly over the Sioux City telegraph, people rushed forward out of their shanties and down Roosevelt Boulevard to meet us. They were all there. The Everharts, the Hunts and the Conleys, Dick Mason and Sherman Brown, Steele O'Neill and Shoes and Long John, Joe and Oscar and Bellowing Bob, and the recently returned banjo player, and Mr. Lucky and T-Bone. T-Bone barked and wagged his tail so wildly he could hardly keep his hind legs on the ground. And there were many others, some whose names I was never quite sure of, others whose names I've forgotten over the years. Papa hobbled forward, his left hand clutching the cane, his right hand extended, and in the next moment he was swallowed up by the crowd and hidden from my view. I stood there on the outskirts of it all, holding Papa's medical bag and feeling very proud. On that hot and dusty afternoon, I made a promise to myself that one day I would be just like Papa. During the months Papa was recovering, Dr. Hal was the only wage earner among us. It was quite a responsibility for a man of 27 to be the sole provider for 12 people, but somehow he did it, and we always had everything we needed. I say 12 because late in that fall of 1932, we got Uncle Jim back, as well as Cousin Jimmy. Before the jailed strikers could be brought to trial, the governor pardoned them and sent them home. Governor Borgman was voted back into office in the next election. Sheriff Dysinger was not. I'm not sure whatever became of Clem Dysinger, because after he lost his place as sheriff, he moved his family away from Minnesota. I was glad to see him go, and told Papa I hoped ex-Sheriff Dysinger never showed his hound dog face in our town again, even if it meant losing Danny for good. Furthermore, I added, I'd consider it just desserts if he couldn't find a job and ended up in a shantytown himself. Let him see what it felt like to go hungry and sleep on the ground while everyone with jobs was calling him a pampered poverty rat and a red vermin. Thinking Papa would agree with me, I was chagrined when my father frowned and said, "Now, Jenny, 2 wrongs don't make a right, you know. Sheriff Dysinger shouldn't have raided Sioux City the way he did, but we can't allow ourselves to go on feeling ill will toward him." "But, Papa," I protested, "he might have been the one to beat you senseless and leave you for dead." "Then he's the one we need to forgive, isn't he?" Papa asked quietly. I narrowed my eyes and huffed a bit. "Have you forgiven him, Papa?" I asked. Papa offered me a sheepish grin. "Well, Jenny, I'm trying. There are those moments when I still want to spit fire at the thought of him, but when they come I just have to forgive Clem all over again. Eventually I'll have the matter settled." It went against the grain, the thought of forgiving a man who had brought so much harm to my father and my friends. But I'd already promised myself I was going to be like Papa, and this gave me the chance to get started. Papa explained that if we went on hating Clem Dysinger because he hated the people of Sioux City, then we were all caught up in a cycle of hate that spun around and never accomplished anything. Only forgiveness can break that cycle of destruction, Papa said. It took me a while of teeth-grinding contemplation and no little bit of brooding, but I finally told Papa that I, too, was willing to forgive Sheriff Dysinger for what he'd done. So anyway, as I was saying, Uncle Jim came home, and not long afterward, Jimmy Jr. found his way back to us on the Sioux line. He had gone first to the Dubbins' old house and found it deserted, but he figured right away he would find his family living with us. He showed up on our doorstep half-starved and bone-thin, but it didn't take long before Mother's and Aunt Sally's cooking filled him out again. We were all so glad to have him back, especially Aunt Sally, that we didn't mind his being one more mouth to feed and one more body needing a place to sleep. He entertained us for months with his stories of riding the rails until Uncle Jim made him stop when Luke started talking about hopping a train and heading west. Neither Uncle Jim nor Cousin Jimmy could find steady work for quite a while, but we told ourselves it would just be a matter of time before the new president got the clogged wheels of the economy oiled and moving again. Even before he was elected, President Roosevelt was talking about his New Deal, a 3R plan that would offer relief, recovery, and reform for the country. All sorts of agencies were formed under the New Deal, 2 of which helped our family directly. In 1935, my uncle got a job through the Works Progress Administration that earned him $63 a month, and the following year, Jimmy Jr. went off with the Civilian Conservation Corps and began mailing home $50 a month. With Papa, Dr. Hal, Uncle Jim, and Jimmy Jr. all contributing to the household kitty, we felt downright rich again. Of course, when Uncle Jim came home from jail, I once more ended up on the couch in Papa's study. I didn't have a room of my own again until 1937, when Uncle Jim could finally afford to move his family to a small house not far from ours. Even then, I had my old room back for only my final summer at home before I left for nursing school, at which time Claudia took it over. It didn't matter. If the only thing the depression took from me was one small room, then I was blessed. Even though prosperity eventually returned to our country, we never quite made it back to those wild and carefree days of the 20s. It was as though we had left the innocence of childhood behind and grown up into the responsibilities of adulthood. America became a superpower, a world leader, and discovered that life means facing things like Cold Wars and Hot Wars, civil rights battles and women's rights battles, a decline in values and an increase in apathy, and what the writers came to call angst. I grew up, too, and discovered how the overarching troubles of the world affect the individuals who live in it, and that sometimes the dreams of youth are flattened out and reshaped by the larger circumstances of life. For me, there were no European honeymoons, no gondola rides through Venice, no midnight walks beside the River Seine. I never knew what it was to sit on a hotel balcony staring up at a full moon with my newly wedded husband. Charlotte married, of course, 3 times in fact, and sent me postcards from each of her African honeymoons. Those postcards were generally slow in reaching me, since they had to make their way into the jungle, up over mountains, or across deserts, depending on where in Central or South America I happened to be working at the time. When I inevitably neared the half-century mark, I abandoned all hope of marriage and resigned myself to the ranks of Miss Cole and the other spinsters I had so pitied and secretly feared. But it wasn't with grief that I gave up my dream. Rather, I felt only a sense of wonder that the single life could be so fulfilling. It was, of course, just when I accepted my solitary existence that I finally met my husband, a fellow medical missionary who, whether by sheer coincidence or by some divine whimsy I've never known, was named Charles Chaplin, spelled one letter differently from the Charlie of the silver screen, but nevertheless pronounced the same. "Dear Charlotte," I wrote, "you'll never believe who I met wandering around the wilds of Guatemala." She wrote back asking whether his feet stuck out like a ballerina's and if he could walk more than 3 steps without falling down. She later sent matching canes and bowler hats as a wedding gift when I told her Charlie Chaplin and I were engaged. Charles proposed to me late one night while we were scrubbing for emergency surgery. When I said yes, we elected not to seal the engagement with a kiss, for fear of spreading germs. The next day he presented me with a silver ring he had bartered for in the marketplace in Guatemala City, using the Spanish he was only just learning. He was a newcomer to the mission field, and finding out later he'd ended up spending more than the original asking price. He slipped it on my finger while we sat in a leaky dugout canoe that threatened to capsize and toss us into the waters of Lake Amatitlan. It had been our intention to watch the sunset over the mountains from this romantic vantage point, but a storm blew in and left us soaked and shivering before we could paddle our rather dubious vessel back to shore. We were married in the chapel on the hospital compound, and contrary to our original plans for a brief escape, we spent our wedding night tending to the victims of a devastating fire in one of the nearby villages. Nevertheless, the sweetest words I ever heard were muttered in the midst of the chaos that night, when Charles asked one of the orderlies, "Manuel, get my wife some water, will you? She looks like she's about to faint." That was the first time Charles called me his wife. It was not exactly what I had dreamed of as a child while spinning the globe with Charlotte, but I was far happier than I ever could have imagined all those years before. My husband and I, until our recent retirement, spent 20 years together immersed in poverty, hardship, filth, and disease, and more importantly, in the incomparable joy that arose from the midst of it all, each time we discovered we had offered a sliver of desperately needed hope that otherwise might not have been there. And that is what I tell my grandnephews and grandnieces, all the grandchildren of Simon, Claudia, and Molly, when they ask me why I chose to spend my life as a missionary nurse working among those uncivilized people in the jungles of Latin America. I remember Papa, and give them the truest answer I know to give, because it made me happy.
The end. You've been listening to A Room of My Own by Anne Tatlock, narrated by Kate Forbes. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.